Imagine if I revealed to you that long before the great deluge swept across the world, a group of celestial beings left their assigned positions in heaven, came down to our planet, and permanently altered the trajectory of human existence. These were known as the Watchers, angels tasked with observing mankind from a distance, yet they made the choice to interfere in ways that would bring devastation, moral decay, and beings of enormous size to our world. Tonight, we're exploring in depth one of the most enigmatic and debated narratives from the ancient writings, the full account of the Watchers. Starting from their initial heavenly assignment all the way through to their illicit relationships with mortal women, continuing to the emergence of the giant Nephilim, and concluding with the ultimate divine punishment that befell them. This represents the complete narrative that the majority of people have never encountered in its entirety. Now, before we get started, if this is your first time here on this channel, think about pressing that like button and subscribing if you haven't done so yet. When you support us, it allows us to keep making these thoroughly researched videos that help you discover something new or simply enjoy your free time. Also, drop a comment telling us your location and what time it is where you are. We're creating a worldwide community right here. So, with that said, let's get into it, shall we? The divine order, heaven before the fall. Long before chaos entered the world, before the initial act of defiance cast its shadow across the universe, there existed a dimension of absolute harmony. Heaven served as the seat of all creation, where the supreme architect ruled over everything with understanding that went beyond comprehension. This wasn't simply a location, but rather a condition of existence where perfect balance flowed like a river without end through every part of reality. Inside this heavenly realm lived beings made of pure illumination and intention. The angels functioned as living expressions of divine will, each one brought into being with particular responsibilities woven directly into the essence of existence. These were not mindless automatons, but aware beings given the gift of comprehension. Each one received a holy assignment that kept the equilibrium of all creation intact. Some delivered communications across the enormous spaces separating heaven from earth. Others served as warriors, protecting the cosmic borders. Additional angels sang worship that echoed through realms invisible to human perception. Within these heavenly hosts, a particular group occupied a distinct role. These were known as the Watchers. The Book of Enoch tells us that these beings functioned as divine observers, selected to witness the developing story of creation taking place below them. Their designation carried significance far deeper than mere watching. They observed with intention, with alertness, with the power given by the Almighty to make certain that the dividing lines between different realms stayed secure. The Watchers counted in the hundreds, possibly even more. They positioned themselves at the boundary separating heaven from the recently formed earth, observing as the garden planet took form beneath their gaze. They witnessed mountains emerging from ancient waters. They observed woodlands extending across valleys, waterways cutting their courses through rock, and the initial humans taking their uncertain first steps in a world crafted especially for them. These angelic observers held knowledge that humanity could barely conceive. They grasped the patterns of celestial bodies, the characteristics of metals buried far beneath the Earth's surface, the mysteries of vegetation and their applications. They understood the names of all things, the authentic names that carried authority over creation itself. This understanding belonged to them by intention, provided so they could accomplish their holy oversight of the developing world. Within the Watchers, rankings developed. Leaders rose up, beings of specific power and jurisdiction. A single name stood out above the rest in the ancient writings, Samyaza. In certain manuscripts, he's identified as Shamihaza or Samyaza, though the core meaning stays the same. He earned respect among those like him, a figure of significant strength whose voice held sway in the gatherings of the Watchers. The initial period of Earth progressed in purity. Humanity grew in number across the planet's surface, constructing basic homes, discovering how to work the land, finding fire, and creating implements. They gazed upward at the celestial lights with amazement, not knowing that eyes gazed back down at them with matching interest. The watchers kept their surveillance from the heights, observing every advancement, every achievement, every uncertain step of human society. Heaven functioned according to a divine framework that preserved cosmic equilibrium. The archangels positioned themselves nearest to the throne, beings of enormous capability, assigned the most vital missions. Michael led the heavenly forces. Gabriel conveyed the most significant communications. Raphael offered restoration. Uriel revealed concealed understanding. Beneath them, the different categories of angels completed their designated responsibilities, forming a harmony of service that maintained creation operating in line with divine intention. The Watchers occupied a position in this framework as observers and protectors. Their station provided them a perspective of both dimensions. They could gaze upward toward the magnificence of heaven and downward toward the splendor of earth. This special viewpoint made them extremely valuable to the divine strategy. They communicated updates about humanity's advancement, tracked the activity of spiritual powers, and guaranteed that the separation between mortal and immortal stayed uncrossed. Nothing within this original structure hinted at the approaching disaster. The arrangement functioned as designed. Angels completed their objectives. Humans experienced their limited lives in relative tranquility. The universe revolved on its foundation without resistance or conflict. If there existed seeds of defiance, they remained inactive, concealed under layers of compliance and habit. However, within this perfection, the ability for choice persisted. The angels weren't machines. They held will, the capacity to choose, to wonder, to question. This liberty represented both their most precious gift and their most hazardous asset. Without this freedom, their devotion held no significance. With it, the prospect of rebellion entered reality. The Book of Enoch characterizes this era as a time when the divisions of heaven and earth remained distinct and unchallenged. The Watchers recognized their position. They comprehended the principles that controlled their existence. They grasped the wisdom in keeping separation between their kind and humanity. For a period, this comprehension proved adequate, but time possesses a tendency to wear down even the most solid beliefs. The Watchers maintained their endless watch, observing generation following generation of humans exist and fade away. They witnessed affection and grief, happiness and pain, the complete range of mortal life. And somewhere within that observation, something started to change. A thought surfaced that should never have been formed. A longing took hold that broke every principle of their creation. The flawless structure of heaven balanced on the brink of its first major catastrophe. The Watchers, selected to protect the limits of creation, would shortly transform into the exact danger they were created to stop. The stage had been prepared, the participants were positioned, and in the consciousness of Samyaza, a question developed that would fracture the peace of the universe and release repercussions that would reverberate through all of human history. A crack in the firmament, the first forbidden thought. The transformation started in a subtle way, similar to the initial hairline split in an enormous barrier. The Watchers carried on with their assigned responsibilities, yet their focus changed. Where previously they had observed humanity with removed curiosity, now their attention remained fixed. The daughters of humanity moved through the world beneath them, and the angels observed with vision that perceived too deeply, craved too intensely, longed for what was never intended to belong to them. The Book of Enoch tells us that the deterioration didn't happen all at once. The prohibited thought entered angelic consciousness slowly, distributing like a gradual toxin through their numbers. These beings, fashioned without the ability for physical longing, discovered themselves undergoing something completely unfamiliar. They gazed at human women and perceived beauty that went beyond simple observation. They noticed elegance in motion, attraction in appearance, and they experienced want. The text documents that Samyaza identified this change first among his companions, or maybe he sensed it first within himself and saw the identical hunger mirrored in the gazes of those surrounding him. Regardless, he grasped that he wasn't isolated in his violation. Additional watchers sheltered the same prohibited yearning. The matter became not if they would take action, but at what point and in what manner. Mount Hermon towers in the ancient territories, a snow-covered summit that reaches toward the heavens. The Book of Enoch names this mountain as the assembly location, the place where heaven and earth came near enough for the unimaginable to happen. The designation itself holds significance. Hermon comes from the Hebrew term herm, which refers to dedication, to consecration, to something designated as sacred. The site served as a boundary, a location where the barrier between dimensions became fragile. The watchers came down to this mountain, not falling, not at this point. This represented a purposeful expedition, an aware decision to abandon their stations and assemble in gathering. They arrived from their positions throughout the universe, meeting at this single location. 200 angels collected on Hermon's summit, each bearing the burden of their prohibited longing, each understanding that what they were considering would destroy the divine structure they had promised to maintain. Samyaza addressed the assembly. The ancient text keeps his statements, and within them we detect the tone of rationalization that comes before every significant violation. He expressed fear. He feared that he, by himself, might carry the blame of such a deed. He suggested that they unite themselves together through a vow, that they divide equally in both the action and its repercussions. If everyone took part, no one could assert innocence. If everyone descended into sin, they descended together. This identified the genuine start of the uprising, not in the journey to the mountain, but in the instant when decision transformed into dedication. The internal deterioration that had been developing in quietness now discovered expression in plotting. The watchers weren't stumbling into wrongdoing. They were organizing it, structuring it, fastening themselves to it through holy pledges that ridiculed the actual idea of holiness. The Book of Enoch characterizes the vow they made on Mount Hermon as dreadful and unbreakable. They called down curses on themselves should anyone waver or pull back. They formed a connection of shared blame, making certain that once started, the deed couldn't be halted or reversed by personal awareness. Each watcher became answerable for maintaining his brothers, dedicated to their collective violation. Yet the prohibited thought that motivated them held a basic lie. The angels persuaded themselves that they could span the distance between immortal and mortal, that they could know physical affection without repercussion, that they could traverse boundaries set at creation without ripping the structure of reality itself. They perceived what they wanted and thought they could claim it without price. The human women beneath stayed unaware of the focus directed at them. They experienced their existence, cared for their households, progressed through their days with no awareness that celestial beings discussed their destinies on a faraway mountain. The daughters of humanity became targets of angelic fixation without any choice in the situation. Playing pieces in a cosmic uprising they didn't select and couldn't stop. Samyaza's anxiety of individual blame discloses something essential about the character of this uprising. Even within their deterioration, the watchers kept sufficient awareness to identify the magnitude of their planned violation. They grasped that what they intended broke every principle of their being. However, rather than permitting this grasp to halt them, they applied it to defend collective deed. If the blame proved too substantial for one, they concluded it could be supported by many. The text identifies the leaders who aligned with Samyaza in this plot. Azazel appears among the most significant, a figure whose designation would become associated with violation and condemnation. Arakiel, who would instruct prohibited signs. Ramiel, who would distribute secrets of the earth. Kokabil, who grasped the activities of the celestial bodies. Ezekiel, Arakiel, Shamziel, Seriel, Tamiel, Turiel, and numerous others. Each contributed particular understanding, particular capabilities that they would subsequently pour out on humanity like venom. The assembly on Mount Hermon signified more than plotting. It represented a distortion of divine gathering, a parody of the heavenly meetings where angels collected to obtain direction from the Almighty. Here they assembled to scheme rebellion. Where they should have been offering praise, they plotted. Where they should have been giving service, they readied to seize. The Book of Enoch stresses that the watchers pledged their vow with complete awareness of what they performed. This wasn't lack of knowledge or mishap. These beings held understanding far surpassing human comprehension. They recognized the framework of creation. They grasped the explanations for divisions between angels and humans. They acknowledged that what they intended would carry disaster. However, they pledged their vow regardless, fastening themselves to a direction that would taint the world and sentence themselves to everlasting retribution. The mountains remained witness to this instant of choice. The snow-covered summit that had experienced only innocence now accommodated the initial significant uprising since creation. The atmosphere itself appeared to pause as 200 voices united in a vow that would transform everything. They committed themselves to come down further, to depart the boundary and step completely into the realm of humanity. They dedicated to claiming wives from among the daughters of mankind. They vowed to distribute the prohibited understanding they held. And with that vow finished, the split in the heavens expanded into an abyss. The watchers hadn't yet contacted the earth, hadn't yet fulfilled their prohibited longing, yet the action was accomplished in principle. The plot was confirmed. The moment of no possibility of return had been traversed. All that stayed was the coming down itself, the ultimate step from thinking into deed, from idea into permanent consequence. The oath on Mount Hermon, the point of no return. The peak of Mount Hermon contained 200 angels, united by statements that couldn't be withdrawn. The vow had been uttered, the plot had been confirmed. What existed previously as separate temptation now solidified into shared rebellion. And the burden of that instant pushed down on the mountain like a tangible power. Samyaza positioned himself at the middle of this assembly. His function changed from observer to designer of cosmic violation. The Book of Enoch documents him as the chief, not because he held superior strength than his companions, but because he expressed what others only ventured to consider. He provided voice to prohibited craving and framework to disorderly yearning. He converted private deterioration into structured defiance. The text keeps the designations of the leaders who aligned with him, and these designations hold meaning beyond simple recognition. Each watcher contributed specific understanding, particular capabilities that would subsequently be released on an unprepared world. Azazel controlled comprehension of metalcraft and combat. Urakiel recognized the indicators of the earth. Ramiel grasped the concealed characteristics of vegetation and minerals. Kokabeel followed the roots of celestial bodies and periods. United, they established a gathering of deterioration, each participant adding to the approaching disaster. The vow itself operated as more than commitment. In the ancient comprehension, statements expressed with purpose and observed by others assumed binding strength. The watchers didn't merely consent to take action. They condemned themselves should they neglect to take action. They formed a spiritual connection that connected their destinies together, guaranteeing that withdrawal became unattainable once the statements departed their mouths. This wasn't casual understanding, but holy promise reversed inside out, sacredness inverted into condemnation. The Book of Enoch tells us they pledged by the designation of the Almighty, adding sacrilege to uprising. They called on the exact power they were opposing to confirm their opposition. The contradiction ran deep and shadowy. These beings, fashioned to offer service and adoration, now applied the instruments of commitment to secure themselves into disloyalty. The mountain observed this distortion in quietness. Hermon's summit had existed for ages as a location where heaven and earth came near, where the environment itself appeared filled with divine attendance. Now, it accommodated the assembly of those who would defile that nearness, who would dismantle the divisions that provided significance to closeness between dimensions. The actual rocks appeared to register the violation, though they couldn't vocalize or object. The quantity carries meaning. 200 angels came down to Hermon, not a chance assembly, but a structured power sufficiently large to distribute across the populated world, adequate to taint completely rather than simply contact and leave. The Book of Enoch separates them into groups, each directed by one of the identified chiefs. These separations indicate organization and preparation that transcended basic desire. The Watchers weren't responding on impulse, but executing a plan. Samyaza grasped something vital about shared blame. He feared that if he by himself came down to claim a human wife, he would carry the complete burden of condemnation. This anxiety motivated him to demand the vow on distributed involvement, on shared damnation. However, his logic held a critical defect. Distributing blame doesn't reduce it. The condemnation wouldn't be separated among them, but increased. Each would confront the complete repercussion of violation, and their participation would only intensify the wrongdoing. The leaders conversed among themselves on that mountain, completing their strategies. They separated the earth into regions, each chief choosing areas where they would come down. They talked about which settlements to visit, which human groups to penetrate. They considered how to show themselves to humanity, whether to disclose their authentic character or to seem as remarkable men. Every aspect obtained focus, every prospect examination. This was uprising with deliberation, wrongdoing with complete consciousness. The Book of Enoch highlights that they took action with awareness of divine principle. They weren't unaware of the divisions they were preparing to traverse. They grasped that angels and humans filled different categories of creation, that combining these categories would generate something abnormal, something that broke the framework of reality itself. However, they advanced regardless, their longing overwhelming their understanding, their desire defeating their comprehension. The vow formed a dreadful oneness. Where previously they had been separate angels with separate temptations, now they transformed into a power, a movement, an uprising with framework and objective. The binding statements changed them from watchers who had neglected their responsibility into dynamic operators of cosmic disturbance. They stopped being inactive observers, tainted by what they perceived, and transformed into participants resolved to reshape reality in line with their longing. As they readied to come down further, to depart the mountain and disperse across the world, each watcher bore multiple loads. They carried the burden of their vow, the awareness of their violation, the expectation of their prohibited desires, satisfaction, and the faint recognition of condemnation to arrive. The Book of Enoch documents that they grasped they would confront repercussions, that their deeds would carry destruction on themselves. However, they appreciated the temporary fulfillment above everlasting consequence. The human world beneath carried on in lack of knowledge. Households assembled for evening food. Children engaged in play in dusty pathways. Women obtained water from sources and processed grain for sustenance. None of them recognized that choices made on a faraway mountain would shortly reshape their world. None grasped that beings of enormous strength had pledged a vow to step into their existences, to claim their daughters, to distribute understanding that humanity wasn't prepared to obtain. Mount Hermon represented the boundary where prospect transformed into certainty. The Watchers had traversed the boundary from thinking to dedication. The vow confirmed their destiny and initiated events that would necessitate divine action to settle. The mountain had observed the change of 200 faithful servants into 200 defiers, of observers into violators, of angels into the designers of disorder. The instant of coming down neared. The vow was finished. The strategies were established. The leaders were selected. All that stayed was to advance off the mountain and step completely into the realm of humanity. 200 angels positioned themselves ready on the boundary of permanent deed, united by statements that couldn't be unspoken, dedicated to a direction that would submerge the world in brutality and necessitate the purifying deluge of divine condemnation. Union and corruption. The Nephilim are born. The Watchers came down from Mount Hermon and dispersed across the surface of the earth. They traveled among humanity not as faraway observers, but as contributors, as beings resolved to traverse the ultimate division between their nature and mortal body. The Book of Enoch documents that they claimed wives from among the daughters of humanity, selecting women in line with their personal longing without consideration for divine intention or natural principle. This joining signified more than physical union. It broke the basic framework of creation itself. Angels were formed as spirits, beings of pure awareness, dressed in heavenly essence. Humans were fashioned from earth, provided with body and vitality, fashioned to exist and multiply within the limits of death. These two categories of being were never intended to combine. The divisions between them represented part of the design of reality, as vital to cosmic structure as the division of illumination from shadow, liquid from solid. However, the Watchers compelled this combining through a deed of ultimate violation. They assumed physical appearance or tainted human appearance to hold their being, or performed some shadowy miracle that permitted spiritual beings to generate descendants with mortal women. The ancient writings don't clarify the process completely. They concentrate instead on the outcome, on the wrongness that surfaced from this unattainable joining. The women carried children, yet these weren't human children. The descendants of the Watchers developed beyond natural boundaries, their bodies expanding with abnormal energy obtained from their angelic inheritance. The Book of Enoch characterizes them as giants, beings of tremendous height whose actual being challenged the principles of nature. They were identified as Nephilim, a designation that holds associations of descending, of throwing down, of those who came down or who produced descent. The text tells us that these Nephilim obtained heights of 300 cubits. The calculation staggers comprehension, indicating beings of such enormous dimension that they rose over normal humans like adults over tiny creatures. Even if we grasp this as symbolic overstatement, highlighting their irregular character rather than exact calculation, the point remains distinct. The Nephilim weren't simply tall individuals, but creations whose dimension alone identified them as breaches of natural structure. Their hungers equaled their height. The Nephilim ate food at speeds no normal home could maintain. They consumed the yield of fields, the livestock of groups, the preserved supplies of complete settlements. The Book of Enoch documents that humanity worked to nourish these giants, yet couldn't fulfill their appetite. The normal patterns of farming and animal raising collapsed under the pressure of maintaining beings whose requirements surpassed what the earth was created to supply. The giants increased as their mothers kept carrying them, and as the Watchers claimed, more wives. Each area, penetrated by the descended angels, witnessed these mixed descendants surface, developing quickly, requiring resources, controlling the territory through pure physical attendance. They transformed into a fresh power in human civilization, one that didn't match into current frameworks of household, group, or settlement. The Book of Enoch highlights that the Nephilim's emergence identified the start of observable deterioration in the world. Prior to their showing, the violation of the Watchers stayed mostly concealed, recognized mainly to heaven and to the angels themselves, yet the giants couldn't be concealed. They traveled among humanity as existing evidence of cosmic uprising, as body and vitality proof that the divisions of creation had been violated. Human civilization bent beneath the burden of this fresh reality. Settlements restructured themselves surrounding the attendance of the Nephilim. Some giants were honored, maybe viewed as champions or defenders, beings of reputation whose power could safeguard or defeat. Others were dreaded, identified as dangers to stability and continuation. Yet all of them signified a basic incorrectness, a distortion of what humanity was intended to be and to transform into. The mothers of the Nephilim confronted unattainable circumstances. They hadn't selected to carry these children, at minimum not with complete comprehension of what they were consenting to when they received the approaches of the Watchers. Now, they discovered themselves nurturing descendants who developed too rapidly, consumed too much, whose actual character positioned them apart from normal human children. The text doesn't document the mother's viewpoints, yet we can picture the combination of dread, satisfaction, bewilderment, and terror they must have sensed. The fathers, the Watchers themselves, viewed their descendants with fulfillment. The Book of Enoch indicates that the giants signified achievement to the descended angels, evidence that their uprising could generate concrete outcomes. The Nephilim represented the Watchers' refusal to receive the restrictions of their fashioned character. If angels were intended only to observe, the giants demonstrated they could fashion. If they were prohibited from combining with humanity, the Nephilim showed that they could triumph over that restriction. However, this fulfillment held the beginnings of deeper disaster. The giants weren't stable creations. They existed as contradictions, beings formed of incompatible components. Their angelic inheritance provided them power and extended life beyond human boundaries. Their human body made them mortal, connected to earth, subjected to physical requirements and longings. This internal struggle showed in their conduct, motivating them to overindulgences that would shortly plunge the world into disorder. The Book of Enoch documents 3 particular dimensions for different groups of giants, indicating variation among the Nephilim. Some obtained 3,000 ells, others 300 cubits, others still different calculations. This diversity suggests that the extent of angelic impact varied among them, that some inherited more of their father's capability, while others leaned more toward their human mother's character. Yet all of them surpassed normal human measurements and requirements. The emergence of the Nephilim changed the world in manners both observable and unobservable. Observably, these giants controlled the territory, their attendance unattainable to disregard. Unobservably, they signified a rip in the structure of creation, an injury in reality itself. The natural structure had been created to operate in line with particular principles. Each creation was to multiply after its nature, within its nature, keeping the divisions that provided framework to being. The Nephilim destroyed these divisions, demonstrating that creation itself could be tainted, that the basic principles could be violated through adequate brutality against cosmic structure. Human society discovered itself accommodating something it was never intended to hold. The giants traveled among the children of Adam, beings who distributed human mothers, yet held character and capability that went beyond humanity. This shared existence couldn't persist. The pressure between natural and abnormal, between fashioned and violating, between what should exist and what should never have existed, would shortly erupt into brutality that would necessitate divine action to settle. The forbidden knowledge, Azazel's rebellion. While the Nephilim signified physical deterioration of the world, another type of pollution distributed through humanity. The Watchers didn't simply claim human wives and produce mixed descendants. They also distributed understanding, pouring out mysteries that were never intended for mortal consciousness, instructing abilities and works that would speed up humanity's fall into brutality and moral breakdown. Azazel directed this intellectual uprising. The Book of Enoch recognizes him as the main instructor of prohibited practices. The angel who assumed particular focus in tainting human civilization rather than simply human bodies. Where other Watchers concentrated on physical joining, Azazel followed deterioration through instruction, distortion through enlightenment, destruction through the distribution of understanding that humanity lacked the comprehension to manage with responsibility. He instructed men the work of metal craft. The text tells us that Azazel demonstrated to humans how to remove ore from the earth, how to heat and purify metals, how to shape implements and armaments from bronze and iron. This might appear advantageous, a present of advancement that would progress society. Yet the Book of Enoch highlights what humans performed with this understanding. They fabricated blades, they shaped spears, They formed instruments of brutality and combat. Prior to Azazel's instruction, struggles between humans stayed restricted by the implements accessible. Conflicts might conclude in injuries or fractured bones. Yet with metal armaments, with edges that could pierce far and points that could divide, brutality assumed fresh permanence. Disputes transformed into conflicts. Disagreements became deadly. The presentation of advanced weaponry didn't simply alter combat. It altered human character itself, making permanent resolutions to temporary struggles appear logical. Azazel also instructed the practice of fabricating bracelets, decorations, and the application of antimony for beautifying eyes. He demonstrated to women how to enhance stones and improve their showing through beautification and decoration. The Book of Enoch regards this understanding as deterioration rather than innocent advancement. The focus on external attractiveness and enticing, showing directed to increased sexual wrongdoing, to conceit, to the emphasis on physical attraction over personality and goodness. Additional watchers added their personal prohibited instructions. Arachiel instructed the indicators of the earth, understanding that permitted humans to analyze natural occurrences in manners that directed them into false belief and incorrect comprehension. Ramiel demonstrated to them the direction of the moon and its impacts, tainting their awareness of heavenly activities with astrological understandings that rejected divine authority. Barakel instructed astrology. Kokabiel distributed understanding of the star patterns and their significances. Ezekiel disclosed comprehension of cloud formations and climate designs. Arachiel demonstrated indicators that could forecast future occurrences. Shamziel instructed about the sun and its patterns. Each portion of understanding appeared valuable in separation, yet together they established arrangement of comprehension that omitted the fashioner, that attempted to clarify being through natural powers and cosmic designs rather than through divine care. The Book of Enoch keeps specific criticism for the instruction of magic. The text documents that the Watchers distributed, understanding of incantations, plant cutting, and the characteristics of vegetation that could restore or damage. They instructed humanity how to control spiritual powers, how to call on capabilities that should have stayed beyond human grasp. This understanding opened entrances that were intended to remain secured, providing humans entrance to spiritual dimensions they lacked the innocence to step into safely. The instruction of these prohibited practices sped up cultural deterioration in manners that enhanced the physical disorder produced by the Nephilim. Humanity obtained capability without comprehension, understanding without grasp, capacity without the moral structure to apply it with responsibility. The outcome was foreseeable. Brutality grew as armaments advanced. Sexual wrongdoing distributed as attraction became more advanced. Spiritual deterioration intensified as humans followed concealed understanding rather than pursuing the fashioner. The Book of Enoch highlights that this understanding was prohibited for solid explanation. These weren't random limitations applied by an envious deity. The divisions surrounding certain understanding existed because humanity at that phase of advancement couldn't manage the accountability such understanding required. Providing advanced metal craft to a brutal species guaranteed that brutality would grow. Instructing magic to beings who barely grasped prayer ensured spiritual deterioration. Azazel's specific concentration on armaments and combat demonstrates importance. The text indicates that he found satisfaction in brutality, that he discovered fulfillment in instructing humans more capable manners to damage each other. His direction transcended basic metalcraft into the philosophy and approach of battle. He didn't simply demonstrate to them how to fabricate blades, he instructed them how to apply those blades, how to structure for conflict, how to consider in terms of defeat and control. The instructions distributed quickly through human groups. Those who discovered from the Watchers obtained benefits over those who stayed unaware. Settlements that held metal armaments defeated those still applying stone implements. People who commanded enticing practices attracted more companions than those who depended on natural showing. Groups that engaged in magic exercised capability that others couldn't equal or oppose. This formed pressure for the prohibited understanding to distribute, as continuation itself appeared to rely on receiving the fresh manners. However, every progression in ability carried matching fall in personality. The Book of Enoch documents that absence of divine reverence grew, that sexual wrongdoing increased, that people violated divisions that had previously been honored. Human civilization, which had been advancing slowly under divine direction, now lurched ahead in advancement while sliding backward in morality. The disproportion formed a world progressively characterized by capability without comprehension, capacity without goodness, understanding without righteousness. The distinction with divine purpose becomes sharp. The fashioner had created human advancement to advance at a calculated speed, with moral development maintaining speed with technological progression. Humans were intended to discover slowly, to develop comprehension alongside ability, to increase in grasp of both natural and spiritual realities under divine instruction. The Watcher's instructions interfered with this divine instruction, flooding humanity with data and capability they weren't prepared to manage. The spiritual repercussions demonstrated as devastating as the physical ones. The Book of Enoch indicates that the prohibited understanding directed human hearts away from adoration of the Almighty. Rather than gazing upward to their fashioner, people gazed inward to their personal capabilities and outward to the powers they could control. Rather than pursuing divine direction, they depended on celestial charts and signals. Rather than relying in divine safeguarding, they shaped superior armaments. The understanding of how overshadowed the understanding of whom. Azazel's uprising thus enhanced the physical deterioration presented by the emergence of the Nephilim. United, they formed a world changed from the one the fashioner had planned. Physical brutality, moral breakdown, spiritual deterioration, and technological progression without comprehension joined to generate a society that was at the same time more capable and more wicked than anything that had arrived previously. The instructions of the Watchers had accomplished their objective, tainting humanity not simply in body, but in consciousness, spirit, and civilization. A world in chaos, the reign of the giants. The Nephilim developed quickly, their development surpassing human advancement by years in simple months. What started as unusual children carried to bewildered mothers shortly transformed into a plague of giants whose attendance destabilized every element of human civilization. The Book of Enoch documents the advancing disaster as these mixed beings asserted control over the earth their mother's people had once tranquilly populated. Their hungers demonstrated insatiable from the initial days. As children, the Nephilim ate food at speeds that strained household resources. As they developed into their complete height, their appetite escalated beyond what any home, any settlement, or any area could logically fulfill. They consumed grain reserves intended to persist seasons. They killed complete groups in single celebrations. The normal rhythms of farming and animal raising, carefully built over generations, fell under the requirements of creations whose requirements surpassed what the earth was created to supply. Humanity tried to satisfy these beings. Initially, settlements structured themselves surrounding nourishing the giants, concluding that participation might keep some amount of tranquility. Farmers committed larger amounts of their yields to fulfilling Nephilim appetite. Shepherds provided their largest livestock. Fishermen carried their complete captures to giant gatherings. Yet no quantity demonstrated adequate. The more humans provided, the more the giants required. Kindness encountered with expectation, then privilege, then demand implemented by overwhelming physical capability. The Book of Enoch documents the instant when satisfaction became unattainable. The text declares that when humanity could no longer nourish the giants, the Nephilim directed against them. This change identifies the movement from domination to hunting, from misuse to direct brutality. The giants, motivated by appetite their human accommodators couldn't fulfill, started to hunt on humanity itself. They ate human body, The text doesn't retreat from this detail, doesn't reduce the terror with indirect language. The Nephilim, these descendants of angels and women, directed to consuming the children of Adam. They consumed human vitality. They pursued people as inferior creations, as nourishment origins to be collected, rather than as relations through their mother's connection. The natural structure reversed completely. Beings partially human, transformed into hunters of the completely human. Yet the giants' brutality reached beyond cannibalism. The Book of Enoch documents that they violated against birds, animals, reptiles, and fish. This mysterious phrase indicates a wider breach of nature, maybe attempts to taint other species as their fathers had tainted humanity, or maybe simply desiring destruction of animal existence beyond any requirement for nourishment. The Nephilim transformed into operators of disorder throughout creation, their actual being an injury in the structure of the natural world. Dread gripped human groups. Settlements that had once cooperated together to nourish the giants now dispersed in terror, pursuing concealing locations in mountains and caverns. The normal activities of society, farming and constructing and nurturing households, transformed into secondary to basic continuation. Parents observed constantly for nearing giants, prepared to conceal their children at the initial indication of hazard. Reliance wore away as desperation developed. In such situations, human civilization itself started to collapse. The giants battled among themselves as properly as against humanity. The Book of Enoch indicates that brutality transformed into universal, that the Nephilim's hostile character expressed itself in all paths. They conflicted with each other for control, for region, for resources. These struggles between beings of superhuman power produced devastation far beyond normal combat. When giants battled, the earth shook. When they confronted, the territory carried the marks. Some giants obtained reputations as powerful combatants and pursuers. The text refers to them as beings of reputation, indicating that despite their monstrous character, they accomplished a nature of dreadful recognition. Accounts distributed of their actions, narratives that combined admiration for their capability with terror at their actions. This reputation added psychological burden to their physical control. Settlements existed in dread, not simply of giants in general, but of particular identified beings whose reputations came before them. The world fell into absence of principle. The joining of giant hunting, human desperation, and the moral deterioration presented by the Watchers, prohibited instructions formed a civilization where strength determined correctness, where the powerful hunted on the vulnerable without limitation, where every hand directed against every other. The Book of Enoch characterizes universal brutality, bloodshed covering the earth, wickedness in every area of human population. The earth itself experienced under this control. The text expresses of the ground crying out, indicating that the brutality and deterioration had spiritual and environmental dimensions beyond the immediately observable. The natural world, fashioned to maintain human existence and flourishing, now suffered under the burden of beings it was never intended to maintain. The vitality of innocent casualties soaked into ground that should have consumed only liquid. The atmosphere bore screams that should never have been expressed. Women carried more Nephilim as the Watchers kept claiming wives. Each fresh emergence added to the disorder. Another giant to nourish, another hunter to dread, another origin of brutality and disturbance. The difficulty compounded over time rather than stabilizing. What started as hundreds of giants developed to thousands, then maybe tens of thousands. The pure quantity of these beings, each necessitating resources far beyond human standard, made the circumstance progressively unsustainable. Human opposition demonstrated futile. What armaments could normal men apply against beings whose power surpassed human boundaries by orders of magnitude? The metal armaments instructed by Azazel might injure other humans, yet they demonstrated insufficient against giant body and bone. Structured protection fell when giants simply traveled through fortifications constructed to human dimension. Every try at opposition concluded in killing, instructing survivors that yielding provided superior odds than defiance. The Nephilim set themselves as controllers in numerous areas. They claimed what they desired, existed where they pleased, ordered tribute from settlements too terrified to decline. Some humans offered service to them willingly, concluding that participation with the giants might supply safeguarding from other giants. Others offered service from pure dread, recognizing that declining indicated immediate ending. A category arrangement surfaced with the Nephilim at the summit, human cooperators beneath them, and the masses at the foundation, existing only to nourish the mechanism of giant hunger. The Book of Enoch highlights that this wasn't the world the fashioner planned. Every element of the disorder, from the giant's cannibalism to the universal brutality to the deterioration of nature itself, signified a leaving from divine creation. The earth had been fabricated as a garden, a location where humanity could flourish under divine direction. The Nephilim changed it into a slaughterhouse, a pursuing ground, a dimension of dread, where the vulnerable existed only as targets for the powerful. However, amid the disorder, some humans stayed righteous. The text hints at people who declined to take part in the wickedness, who kept their adoration of the Almighty despite the surrounding deterioration. These limited became vital, for their cries would shortly reach heaven and trigger the divine reaction that the world so desperately required. Yet for now, they experienced alongside everyone else, observing wrongdoings they were powerless to stop, viewing the world slide deeper into shadow with each advancing day. The cries of the earth, humanity's plea for help, the brutality obtained a peak, vitality soaked the ground in every area. Human bodies remained scattered across fields and through woodlands, casualties of giants who pursued for entertainment as much as appetite. The Book of Enoch documents that the earth itself transformed into, filled with experiencing, that the actual rocks carried witness to wrongdoings that challenged comprehension. Creation suffered under the burden of deterioration it was never created to carry. Among the masses of terrified humanity, the righteous lifted their tones. They offered worship, not with the casual requests of tranquil times, but with the desperate intensity of those who perceive no prospect except divine action. Their worship rose like vapor from countless concealed locations, from caverns where households cowered, from woodlands where refugees pursued protection, from secret chambers where the faithful assembled to offer adoration despite the hazard. These worship carried particular content. The Book of Enoch keeps the character of the cry. The righteous didn't simply request personal safeguarding or relief. They demanded justice. They required that heaven recognize what was occurring on earth. They urged that the Almighty perceive the brutality, identify the deterioration, and take action in line with divine character to position things correct. Their worship transformed into accusations as much as requests, pointing heavenward with urgency that wouldn't be disregarded. The text documents 4 archangels as observers to these cries. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel detected the tones rising from earth. They perceived the bloodshed, observed the brutality, tracked the complete collapse of the structure they had helped set at creation. These powerful beings, who had stayed faithful while their fellow watchers descended, now represented as observers to the repercussions of that descent. They transformed into supporters for humanity before the throne of the Almighty. The earth itself aligned the chorus of complaint. The Book of Enoch tells us that the ground cried out against the brutality performed on it. This wasn't figure of speech, but spiritual reality. The earth, fashioned to maintain existence, discovered itself compelled to absorb ending on a massive dimension. Innocent vitality sought into ground that should have consumed only liquid and precipitation. The natural world, created to function in line with divine principles, discovered those principles broken in every area of creation. The spirits of the killed added their tones. The text indicates that those who perished under giant brutality didn't advance quietly into ending. Their spirits cried out for vindication, for recognition of the wrongdoing they had experienced. They required that heaven react to their murders, that divine righteousness address the violations committed against them. These tones of the ended mingled with the worship of the existing, forming a harmony of experiencing that obtained the highest heaven. The righteous identified particular angels in their worship. They demanded on Michael, the leader of heavenly forces. They called on Gabriel, the divine communicator. They cried out to Raphael and Uriel, archangels whose actual designations expressed of divine qualities that appeared absent from earth. By identifying these beings, the worship assumed legal personality, formal appeals to recognized powers within the heavenly ranking. The humans weren't vaguely hoping for assistance. They were particularly requiring action from beings they recognized, held capability and accountability. The content of the worship disclosed the depth of human experiencing. The Book of Enoch documents accusations against the Watchers, detailed characterizations of their violations. The righteous communicated everything. The vow on Mount Hermon, the claiming of human wives, the emergence of the Nephilim, the instruction of prohibited understanding, the brutality and bloodshed that occurred. They presented the case against the descended angels with accuracy, guaranteeing that heaven couldn't assert lack of knowledge of what occurred on earth. Women who had carried Nephilim added their witness. Though the text doesn't provide them tones directly, their occurrence established part of the shared cry. They had been claimed by beings of overwhelming capability. They had carried children who developed into terrors. They had viewed their sons transform into hunters who endangered their personal households. Their experiencing bore unique burden, caught between angelic fathers and human settlements, fitting completely to neither. The worship required deed, not simply requested it. The tone changed from request to urgency. How extended would heaven permit this deterioration to persist? How much vitality must soak the earth before divine righteousness reacted? The righteous pushed against the divisions of proper worship, motivated by desperation to express with boldness that might have appeared presumptuous in calmer times. Yet these weren't calm times, and conventional devotion appeared insufficient to the crisis. The Book of Enoch highlights the persistence of these worship. They didn't rise once and stop. Day following day, night following night, tones demanded upward. The righteous kept their appeal despite no immediate reaction, despite persisted experiencing, despite every explanation to think they had been abandoned. Their trust held even when situations indicated trustlessness might be more logical. This persistence itself transformed into part of their witness, evidence that some stayed loyal to the Almighty even in the midst of universal deterioration. The archangels bore these worship before the throne. They added their personal observations, their personal witness about situations on earth. Michael expressed of the brutality he had observed. Gabriel communicated on the deterioration, distributing through human civilization. Raphael characterized the experiencing of the innocent. Uriel detailed the spiritual damage performed by the instruction of prohibited understanding. United, they constructed a comprehensive case that required divine reaction. Heaven's reaction wasn't immediate from the human viewpoint. Days advanced, maybe weeks or months, while the experiencing persisted. Yet the Book of Enoch makes distinct that divine righteousness, though it may appear gradual from mortal perspective, functions in line with flawless timing. The worship were detected. The cries were recognized. The case was being examined by the highest power in being, and a reaction was being readied that would address not simply the symptoms, but the foundation causes of Earth's deterioration. The instant neared when divine patience would conclude and divine condemnation would start. The worship of the righteous had accomplished their objective, carrying the crisis on earth to the focus of heaven's throne. The observers had witnessed. The proof had been shown. The accused had been recognized. All that stayed was for the Almighty to express the statement that would initiate the purifying of a tainted world and the retribution of those who had tainted it. The divine council convenes. Judgment is decreed. The worship obtained the throne. The cries of humanity and earth could no longer be disregarded or postponed. The book of Enoch tells us that the Almighty assembled a gathering, a meeting of heavenly capabilities to address the crisis that had surrounded creation. This wasn't consideration carried from uncertainty, but the formal process by which divine righteousness would be proclaimed and completed. The archangels positioned before the attendance of the Almighty. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel showed their witness, repeating what they had observed on earth and what they had detected in the worship of the righteous. They characterized the Watcher's uprising, the emergence of the Nephilim, the instruction of prohibited understanding, and the universal brutality that had occurred. They presented the case with accuracy, guaranteeing that every element of the deterioration obtained proper recognition. The Book of Enoch documents that the Almighty already recognized everything the archangels communicated. Divine all-knowing necessitated no witness, no observers, no showing of proof. However, the formal process offered significant objectives. It set the righteousness of what would occur. It showed that condemnation arrived not from random divine impulse, but from proper examination of facts and violations. It demonstrated that even divine righteousness functioned in line with structure and process. The verdict arrived swiftly once the witness concluded. The Watchers had violated beyond restoration. They had left their stations, broken their character, tainted humanity, and instructed understanding that sped up wickedness. They had generated descendants who ate human body and consumed human vitality. They had changed the earth from a garden into a place of death. For these violations, they would confront retribution that equaled the severity of their violation. Yet, condemnation reached beyond the Watchers themselves. The Nephilim, though they took action in line with their tainted characters, couldn't be permitted to persist their hunting. The deterioration they signified had to be eliminated from the earth. The human groups who had discovered and engaged in the prohibited instructions required purifying. The complete fashioned structure necessitated cleansing, a reset that would eliminate the taint of angelic uprising and provide humanity a fresh beginning. The Almighty released particular orders to each archangel. To Uriel descended the responsibility of warning Noah, the single righteous individual whose household would continue the approaching purifying. Uriel would disclose the divine strategy, clarifying that a deluge would shortly wash away all deterioration from the earth's surface. Noah must construct a container, an ark that would keep him, his household, and representatives of the animal kingdom through the approaching flood. Raphael obtained orders regarding Azazel particularly. The angel who had instructed armaments and combat, beautification and attraction would confront specific retribution. Raphael was ordered to fasten Azazel, to throw him into shadow, to cast him into a location of sharp rocks and rough stones in the wilderness of Dudael. There, covered by the earth, Azazel would stay until the significant day of condemnation when he would be thrown into fire for everlasting retribution. Gabriel's mission concentrated on the Nephilim. He was to produce the giants to direct on each other, to transmit them into conflict where they would destroy themselves. This offered multiple objectives. It would decrease their quantities before the deluge. It would show that their power, though significant against humans, demonstrated useless when directed against their personal nature. It would demonstrate that beings carried a violation held within themselves the beginnings of their personal destruction. Michael obtained the most comprehensive assignment. He would confront Samyaza and the other Watchers directly. He would observe their fastening and imprisonment. He would guarantee that they confront the complete burden of divine condemnation for directing the uprising that had tainted the earth. The Book of Enoch identifies that Michael would demonstrate the Watchers the destiny of their children, compelling them to view the Nephilim, destroy each other before confronting their personal retribution. The divine order contained provisions for humanity beyond Noah's household. Though the deluge would purify the earth of the current generation, the faithful who had cried out for righteousness would be vindicated. Their worship would be responded, their experiencing recognized, their loyalty rewarded in the memory of heaven, even if they didn't continue to perceive the fresh world. The righteous ended would obtain righteousness, and their descendants through Noah would inherit a purified earth. The Book of Enoch highlights that this condemnation wasn't hasty or extreme. Every component of the divine reaction equaled accurately the character and extent of the deterioration. The watchers would be fastened because they had fastened themselves through their vow on Mount Hermon. The Nephilim would destroy each other because they had destroyed the innocent. The earth would be washed because vitality had contaminated it beyond any inferior remedy. The retribution matched the violations with flawless accuracy. However, within the condemnation, compassion functioned. Noah and his household would continue. The animal kingdom would be kept. Vegetation existence would persist beneath the liquids to sprout again when the deluges withdrew. The earth itself, though purified by disaster, wouldn't be destroyed, but renewed. The divine reaction aimed not at obliteration, but at restoration, eliminating deterioration while keeping what could still be preserved. The archangels obtained their orders and readied to come down. Each grasped the gravity of their mission. They would be executing divine righteousness on a dimension unprecedented since creation. They would be confronting beings who had once been their companions, angels who had selected uprising over devotion. They would be concluding an age and starting a fresh one. The burden of cosmic history pushed on them as they left the divine attendants to complete the orders they had obtained. The gathering concluded. The condemnation had been ordered. The missions had been assigned. All that stayed was completion, the execution of divine intention through angelic operation. The watchers would shortly discover that their uprising, though it had achieved in tainting the earth, couldn't triumph over divine authority. The Nephilim would find that their power indicated nothing against divine order. And humanity would observe that the worship of the righteous, though extended, postponed, would ultimately be responded with righteousness that shook the actual foundations of the world. The arrest of the watchers, the archangels' mission. The archangels came down from heaven with power that couldn't be opposed. They arrived not as observers, but as completers of divine condemnation, carrying orders that would reshape the earth and punish those who had tainted it. The Book of Enoch documents their missions with clarity, demonstrating how each angel completed the particular responsibility assigned to them by the Almighty. Raphael traveled first toward his target. He pursued Azazel, the instructor of armaments and combat, the angel who had demonstrated humanity how to shape instruments of ending. Raphael discovered him in the populated areas, maybe surrounded by humans who still pursued his direction, still hungry for the prohibited understanding he distributed. The powerful archangel seized Azazel with capability that the descended watcher couldn't oppose. The text tells us that Raphael fastened Azazel hand and foot. This wasn't physical limitation alone, but spiritual fastening, the restriction of capabilities that Azazel had exercised since his fashioning. Raphael then transported the fastened angel to the wilderness of Dudael, a location of emptiness far from human population. The site itself bore significance. Azazel, who had carried understanding of society's most advanced implements, would be imprisoned in the most uncivilized location on earth. Raphael threw Azazel into a pit or opening in the wilderness floor. He positioned rough and jagged stones on him, covering the descended angel with earth and rock. The Book of Enoch identifies that Azazel was covered by shadow, confirmed beneath the ground, where no illumination could obtain. This burial offered as both retribution and imprisonment, guaranteeing that Azazel could no longer impact humanity, could no longer instruct prohibited practices, could no longer distribute deterioration through understanding. The text documents that Azazel would stay in this wilderness prison until the significant day of condemnation. His retribution wasn't yet finished. The shadow of Dudael signified a holding location, a location of confinement where he would await the ultimate verdict. On that ultimate day, Raphael would return to throw Azazel into everlasting fire, finishing the retribution for his function in tainting the earth. Yet for now, burial beneath jagged stones in the wilderness would be adequate. Gabriel followed his mission with equal resolve. His responsibility involved producing the Nephilim to destroy each other, directing the giants' power against themselves. The Book of Enoch doesn't detail exactly how Gabriel accomplished this, yet the outcome was distinct. The giants started to battle among themselves with fury that equaled their dimension. Conflicts erupted between them, struggles that devastated the territory and decreased their quantities significantly. These battles between giants offered divine objective beyond simple decrease of their group. They showed that power without righteousness directs on itself, that capability separated from divine direction transforms self-destructive. The Nephilim, who had terrified humanity with their strength, now underwent dread themselves as they confronted opponents equally powerful. They discovered too late that their abnormal character held the beginnings of their personal conclusion. Michael's mission necessitated confronting the leader of the Watchers directly. He pursued Samyaza, the angel who had first suggested the vow on Mount Hermon, who had structured the uprising, who carried primary accountability for the cascade of deterioration that had occurred. The Book of Enoch shows Michael as the leader of heavenly powers, the appropriate power to arrest the leader of the descended angels. Michael fastened Samyaza, along with the other leaders of the Watchers. The text identifies them: Arakoba, Ramiel, Kobal, Tamiel, Ramiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Betel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, Seriel. Each obtained the identical fastening, the identical stripping of capability that stopped further deed on earth. These powerful angels who had come down with such confidence to follow their longings now discovered themselves powerless before the completers of divine righteousness. Michael completed his mission with specific objective. The Book of Enoch documents that he made. The fastened Watchers observed the destruction of their descendants before they confronted their personal imprisonment. They had to view the Nephilim conflict each other, had to perceive their sons descend beneath the armaments and power of their brothers. This compelled observing added psychological torment to physical fastening, guaranteeing the Watchers grasped completely the repercussions of their uprising. The text highlights that the Watchers couldn't oppose. These beings, who had appeared so capable when hunting on humans, demonstrated helpless before archangels taking action with divine power. Their deterioration had weakened them. Their uprising had stripped them of the power that arrives from alignment with divine objective. They couldn't battle, couldn't escape, could only yield to the fastening and imprisonment that divine righteousness required. The arrest of the Watchers transmitted shockwaves through the remaining human groups. Those who had offered service to the descended angels, who had discovered their instructions and depended on their safeguarding, suddenly discovered themselves left. The giants who had controlled through power now conflicted each other instead of terrifying humanity. The complete arrangement of capability and misuse that the uprising had fashioned fell within days as the archangels completed their missions with capable accuracy. Uriel, meanwhile, completed his responsibility of warning Noah. He showed to the righteous individual, clarifying that a significant deluge would shortly cover the earth. He directed Noah to construct an ark, supplying particular dimensions and building details. This mission varied from the others, bearing prospect rather than condemnation, keeping rather than destruction. Through Noah, humanity would continue the purifying to arrive. Through his household, the earth would be repopulated after the liquids withdrew. The Book of Enoch shows these missions as coordinated rather than sequential. The archangels took action at the same time, each completing their assigned function in the larger divine strategy. While Raphael imprisoned Azazel in Dudael, Gabriel motivated the Nephilim to shared killing. While Michael fastened Samyaza and his companions, Uriel directed Noah in ark building. The divine reaction to uprising progressed on multiple fronts, addressing every element of the deterioration with appropriate countermeasures. The rapidity of these occurrences would have appeared unattainable to human observers. The Watchers, who had traveled the earth for generations, were suddenly arrested and imprisoned. The Nephilim, who had appeared invincible, started destroying each other. The complete framework of deterioration, which had been constructing for decades or extended, fell within what must have appeared like instants. Divine capability, once released, traveled with irresistible power. However, even in condemnation, structure prevailed. The archangels didn't take action chaotically or randomly. Each completed their particular mission as ordered. Each addressed the specific element of deterioration assigned to them. The arrest and fastening of the watchers showed that divine righteousness functioned with accuracy, that retribution equaled violation, that every rebellious angel obtained exactly what their deeds warranted. The control of the descended had concluded, and the control of divine righteousness had started. The vision of Enoch, the scribe of righteousness. Among all humanity, caught in the disorder of the Watcher's deterioration, a single individual represented a part. Enoch traveled with the Almighty in a generation that had mostly left righteousness. The Book of Enoch, which carries his designation, documents his unique function in the progressing drama of condemnation. He transformed into more than observer or survivor. He transformed into intermediary, the human tone that would bear divine communications to the imprisoned angels. The text shows Enoch as a scribe of righteousness. He held unique capacity to perceive beyond the physical dimension into spiritual reality. The Almighty provided him visions that disclosed the workings of heaven, the character of condemnation, and the destiny awaiting both the righteous and the wicked. These visions changed Enoch from an ordinary individual into a prophet of remarkable importance, someone who could travel between earthly and heavenly dimensions with comprehension that went beyond normal human restrictions. Enoch obtained his initial major vision after the archangels had fastened the watchers. The imprisoned angels, now stripped of their capability and confronting condemnation, transmitted a request to Enoch. They requested him to compose a petition on their behalf, to bear their appeal for compassion before the throne of the Almighty. The audacity of this request represents the actual beings whose uprising had produced such destruction now pursued a human intermediary to request for pardon they had not provided to their casualties. The Book of Enoch documents that Enoch initially consented to compose their petition. He positioned beside the liquids of Dan, south of Hermon, in the ancient territories where the Watchers had first assembled to pledge their vow. He composed down their request with careful focus to their statements. They admitted their violation. They recognized their retribution as righteous. They appealed for compassion, for decrease of their sentence, for any favor that might be reached despite their violations. Yet, as Enoch readied to show this petition to heaven, he descended into a trance. A vision overcame him, pulling his awareness beyond the physical world into the dimension of divine attendance. He perceived the throne chamber of the Almighty. He observed the gatherings of heaven, and in that vision he obtained the reaction he was to bear back to the imprisoned watchers. The vision disclosed condemnation without compassion for the descended angels. The divine tone expressed through Enoch's vision, clarifying why the watchers' petition wouldn't be provided. They had been fashioned as spiritual beings, immortal and holy. They had been provided positions of accountability and reliance. They had observed the magnificence of heaven firsthand. However, they had left all of this to follow physical longings, to taint humanity, to break the basic framework of creation. The vision highlighted a vital distinction. Humans who violated could pursue compassion because they were fashioned mortal, restricted in comprehension, subjected to physical longings by their actual character. Humans could assert vulnerability, lack of knowledge, the overwhelming pressure of situation. Yet angels hold no such excuse. They were fashioned with complete awareness, full comprehension of divine principle, and spiritual character that went beyond physical restriction. Their uprising arrived from pure selection, unmitigated by situation or restriction. Therefore, their retribution would be absolute. Enoch perceived in his vision the everlasting destiny awaiting the Watchers. They would stay fastened until the significant day of condemnation. On that ultimate day, They would be thrown into valleys of fire, into everlasting flame that would never be extinguished. They would confront this retribution not for a period, but forever, undergoing the repercussions of their uprising throughout endless ages. The vision departed no space for prospect, no prospect of restoration, no opportunity for compassion to triumph over righteousness. The vision also disclosed the destiny of the Nephilim. When the giants perished, whether through shared killing or through the approaching deluge, their spirits wouldn't discover rest. Unlike human spirits, which returned to the fashioner, the disembodied essences of the Nephilim would stay on earth. These spirits would transform into demons, unclean spirits that would afflict humanity throughout all generations until the ultimate condemnation. The deterioration the Watchers presented would thus persist in spiritual appearance even after its physical showing had been destroyed. Enoch awakened from the vision, bearing a load of awareness limited humans could carry. He grasped the complete scope of divine condemnation. He recognized the destiny of the Watchers, the future of the Nephilim spirits, and the approaching purifying of the earth through deluge. He bore accountability to convey this communication to beings who wouldn't desire to detect it, to angels who would discover no comfort in his statements. The Book of Enoch documents his return to the Watchers. He discovered them in their location of imprisonment, fastened and shadowed, awaiting his return with desperate prospect. They gazed to him expectantly, thinking that his petition on their behalf might have traveled the Almighty to compassion. Enoch confronted them, carrying not the response they longed for, but the verdict they deserved. He expressed to them, with the power provided by his vision, he conveyed the divine condemnation without reducing or alteration. He clarified why compassion wouldn't be reached, why their retribution represented as ordered, why they would confront everlasting fire rather than temporal correction. He detailed the logic behind their sentence, making distinct that they obtained righteousness rather than random harshness. The Watchers' reaction to Enoch's communication disclosed the depth of their hopelessness. They had expected for compassion despite recognizing their violations. They had thought that admission and petition might modify their destiny. Now, they confronted the reality that their uprising had positioned them beyond restoration. The text documents their lamentation, their weeping, their recognition that they had carried this retribution on themselves through selections made with complete awareness of the repercussions. Enoch's function as intermediary offered objectives beyond simply conveying a communication. His humanity highlighted the perversity of the Watchers' uprising. They, who had been fashioned higher than humans, now necessitated a human to express truth to them. They, who had instructed prohibited understanding to humanity, now obtained ultimate comprehension from a human prophet. The reversal was finished and devastating. The vision also disclosed to Enoch details about the framework of heaven and the character of divine righteousness. He perceived dimensions and realms that humans weren't normally intended to detect. He observed the functions of angels who had stayed faithful. He grasped the cosmic scope of the uprising and its retribution. This awareness changed him, providing him viewpoint that went beyond his mortal being and readying him for his eventual translation into heaven without undergoing ending. The Book of Enoch shows this episode as vital to comprehending the complete impact of the Watchers' uprising. The descended angels weren't simply punished, but were compelled to grasp why their retribution was righteous, to recognize that they had obtained exactly what their deeds warranted. Enoch offered, as the human tone of divine righteousness, the righteous individual whose communication condemned those who had tainted righteousness. The Watcher's confession, a lament of futility. The fastened angels obtained Enoch's communication with the complete burden of its significance. The Book of Enoch keeps their reaction, an admission and lamentation that offers as warning to any who might examine following their route. Their statements disclose the internal condition of beings who grasped too late the repercussions of uprising, who confronted everlasting retribution with complete consciousness of how easily it might have been avoided. The Watchers first recognized their violation. They admitted that they had left their holy station in heaven. They confessed they had tainted themselves with human women. They recognized instructing prohibited understanding that sped up humanity's fall into wickedness. The admission arrived without excuse or defense. They couldn't assert lack of knowledge. They couldn't appeal situation. They had recognized what they were performing at every step, and now they possessed the complete burden of their selections. Their lamentation concentrated on the permanence of their circumstance. They identified that no petition would travel divine righteousness toward compassion. They grasped that no quantity of regret could reverse what they had performed or modify the retribution they would confront. The finality of their destiny pushed on them with crushing power. Angels accustomed to existing in eternity now confronted eternity of a varied nature, one characterized by experiencing rather than magnificence. The text tells us that the watchers expressed of the dread they sensed. These beings who had motivated dread in others now underwent it themselves. They who had traveled the earth as capable operators, able to claim what they longed for, now cowered in shadow, stripped of capability, confronting a future that provided no prospect of reprieve. The reversal couldn't have been more finished. The powerful had descended, and descended utterly. They lamented most bitterly the destiny of their children. The watchers had viewed as the Nephilim destroyed each other in conflicts arranged by Gabriel. They had observed their descendants, beings of tremendous power and hunger, direct that power against their personal nature. The giants, who had appeared invincible when hunting on humans, demonstrated mortal when battling equals. The watchers perceived in their children's destruction a preview of their personal approaching condemnation. The Book of Enoch documents that the descended angels requested Enoch to petition again on their behalf, despite his distinct communication that such appeals would be futile. Desperation motivated them to request for what had already been rejected. They held to any prospect, however distant, that their destiny might be modified. This desperation itself transformed into part of their retribution, the torment of prospect that they recognized was false, yet couldn't quite leave. Enoch reacted with firmness. He clarified again that their petition had been detected and rejected. The Almighty had examined their case and discovered no grounds for compassion. The watchers weren't being punished for lack of knowledge or vulnerability, but for purposeful uprising committed with complete awareness. Angels fashioned to offer service had selected to taint. Beings formed for holiness had accepted defilement. For such violation, no compassion would be reached. The lamentation contained identification of their previous condition. The watchers recalled what they had been before their descent. They remembered positioning in the attendance of divine magnificence, taking part in heavenly gatherings, offering service to objectives that went beyond mortal comprehension. They contrasted that magnificent past with their present condition of imprisonment and their future destiny of everlasting fire. The comparison only intensified their anguish. They also lamented the impact of their uprising on humanity. Though self-concentrated in their hopelessness, they recognized that they had carried experiencing on innocent people. They had tainted a species, not their personal broken divisions, not theirs to traverse, instructed understanding, not theirs to distribute. They identified that human vitality cried out against them, that their violations reached beyond their personal destiny to include the destruction of countless others. The Book of Enoch keeps particular accusations the watchers made against themselves. They admitted that they had been in heaven, yet had longed for the daughters of humanity. They confessed that they had claimed wives and defiled themselves with human vitality. They recognized that through their descendants, much vitality has been poured on the earth. Each statement constructed on the previous, forming a comprehensive recognition of blame that departed no space for rejection or deflection. Their admission contained identification that they had broken their character. Angels weren't fashioned for physical multiplication. They existed as spiritual beings whose devotion to the Almighty characterized their objective and significance. By pursuing to undergo physical longings, they had tried to transform into something they weren't created to be. This breach of their vital character added to the severity of their retribution. The lamentation also contacted on the futility of their accomplishment. What had they obtained? Temporary fulfillment that concluded in everlasting experiencing. Brief occurrences of physical satisfaction that cost them everything they had been fashioned to hold and appreciate. The satisfaction-to-cost ratio disclosed their uprising as not simply wicked but foolish, a trade that no logical being would make if they genuinely grasped the repercussions. The text tells us that they appealed for their petition to at minimum be detected, even if it couldn't be provided. They desired recognition from heaven, some identification that their regret was genuine, even if insufficient to modify their destiny. Yet even this small comfort was rejected. Heaven had expressed through Enoch. The condemnation was ultimate. No further appeals would be entertained or recognized. The watchers' hopelessness intensified as they completely grasped their circumstance. They would stay fastened in shadow until the ultimate condemnation. They would then be thrown into everlasting fire. They would experience forever repercussions of selections made in instants. The disproportion between deed and retribution appeared crushing, though Enoch clarified that their awareness and character made their violations worthy of such reaction. Inferior beings might obtain inferior retribution, yet angels who rebelled with complete comprehension deserved the complete burden of divine wrath. The lamentation concluded with quietness. The watchers had nothing remaining to express. They had admitted completely, appealed desperately, and obtained ultimate rejection. They settled into their prison of shadow to await the condemnation day that would finish their retribution. Their tones, which had once instructed prohibited understanding and ordered giant descendants, now descended quiet in the confrontation of permanent doom. The Book of Enoch shows this admission and lamentation as a moral lesson for all who might detect it. The destiny of the watchers proves that rising up against the divine structure, no matter what short-term advantages it appears to provide, eventually brings complete devastation. Their anguish reveals that decisions carry repercussions, that understanding brings obligation, and that entities who betray their essential nature and calling will encounter judgment matching their awareness and station. The fallen angel's cry resonates throughout the text, serving as caution and illustration, a witness to the pointlessness of resisting the divine structure that upholds all of existence. The watcher's acknowledgement, an expression of meaninglessness. Shadows envelope them at present. The watchers, who previously existed in brilliance beyond mortal understanding, discover themselves restrained in darkness that perpetually remains. Restraints fashioned from heavenly verdict confine them in locations where temporal flow operates distinctly, where every instant extends into an endless period of contemplation. These beings who came down with such assurance now remain amid the wreckage of their decision. Enoch moves through their midst, serving as an envoy. This virtuous individual, removed from his tranquil existence, now appears before entities who previously directed countless hosts. He brings the pronouncement of the heavenly assembly. The ruling has been finalized. No pardon will come, no additional opportunity, no compassion that reverses what has transpired. The acknowledgement starts with Semiaza. Previously a commander within the celestial forces, he now communicates from his confinement. His statements resound through Enoch's record, maintained so future ages might grasp the significance of violation. He expresses remorse, cutting more profoundly than any mortal grief. The pledge upon Mount Hermon appeared like freedom at that time, 200 voices making promises collectively, united through shared determination. They considered their longing validated the shattering of universal law. At present, Semiaza perceives with clarity, the mortal women they claimed as spouses were never theirs to possess. The offspring produced from these connections delivered only destruction. The Nephilim consumed the planet's provisions, then attacked humanity directly. Every scream of fear, every supplication for rescue, every portion of blameless blood, it all connects to that mountain pledge. The burden of this reality crushes down upon him within the shadows. Azazel's mourning possesses a distinct quality. Where Samyaza grieves over the violation of heavenly structure, Azazel laments the degradation he specifically brought forth. He instructed humans to create instruments of combat. He demonstrated to women the practices of beautification and enticement. He unveiled secrets of magic and celestial interpretation never intended for mortal consciousness. Every instruction appeared as a contribution during that period. Information naturally increases capacity. Comprehension delivers strength. Yet, Azazel currently recognizes what his contributions genuinely produced. The blades he taught mortals to fashion turned kinsman against kinsman. The beautification products he disclosed became instruments of control and self-absorption. The magical arts he distributed opened pathways to more sinister spiritual entities. Brutality expanded throughout the planet like a contagion. Humanity, given information, absent understanding, annihilated itself with the precise instruments he supplied. His restrained existence in Dudael's wilderness stands as a testament to the hazard of wrongly placed illumination. The remaining watchers contribute their declarations to this symphony of hopelessness. Barakel, who instructed in star reading, observes as mortals employ the heavens not for amazement, but for divination and deceptive prophecy. Kokabil, who disclosed the mysteries of star patterns, witnesses how heavenly understanding becomes distorted into superstition. Tamiel, who revealed prohibited celestial science, sees consecrated designs turned blasphemous. Every watcher added to humanity's downfall in particular methods. Each currently carries the weight of that addition. Their appeals to Enoch expose a basic failure to comprehend. They implore him to mediate, to transport their requests to the throne of verdict. They construct deliberate justifications. They were simply drawn to attractiveness. They merely distributed information. Their purposes contained no ill will. Certainly the harshness of their condemnation surpasses the offense. Enoch pays attention. Subsequently, he conveys the answer from above. Their justifications hold no significance. Attractiveness existed prior to their coming down. Still, they preserved restrictions. Information resided in the heavenly domain for purposes they grasped completely. Their purposes weigh less than their deeds. They understood the statute. They violated it regardless. They degraded both physical form and essence, transgressing the foundational structure of existence itself. The meaninglessness washes over them like surging waters. No challenge will exist. No justification alters the ruling. The harm cannot be reversed. The Nephilim have devastated the planet. Humanity has acquired brutality and corruption far exceeding what organic development would have instructed. The actual substance of existence displays wounds from their uprising. Beyond mere condemnation, their confinement fulfills a universal intention. They must stay restrained so the world can receive purification. The deluge will eliminate the bodily degradation, the giants, the tainted bloodlines, the frameworks constructed on prohibited information. However, the spiritual degradation demands a separate resolution. The watchers themselves must be extracted from influence, enclosed where their suggestions cannot reach mortal perception. Enoch's record maintains their lamentations in thorough detail. These are not simple artistic elements. They exist as cautions, accounts from individuals who violated the ultimate restriction. Their statements possess the credibility of direct knowledge. They existed in magnificence and selected deterioration. They held understanding and exchanged it for appetite. They functioned in the heavenly presence and deserted it for worldly satisfaction. Their acknowledgement encompasses a dreadful awareness. They will stay imprisoned until the ultimate day of reckoning. Ages of humanity will emerge and disappear. Kingdoms will flourish and decay. The planet will rotate through innumerable cycles, and they will remain in shadows, conscious of every moment passing, incapable of acting, incapable of transformation, unable to flee the repercussions of that isolated decision on Mount Hermon. Certain ones among them attempt to accuse each other. Samyaza asserts he experienced coercion from the others. Lesser watchers state they simply imitated their commander's pattern. Yet these efforts at deflection sound empty within their prison. Every single one pledged the oath willingly. Every single one came down through personal decision. Every single one claimed mortal wives, understanding completely the restriction. Shared responsibility does not reduce personal accountability. The spiritual entities who previously traveled between dimensions with facility now discover themselves limited to a solitary position in existence. They who observe the shaping of peaks, the emergence of celestial bodies, currently witness nothing except shadows. Their immense understanding becomes pointless in restraints. Their strength turns internally, devouring itself with regret. Enoch documents every statement. His function as recorder guarantees that this acknowledgement endures the deluge, travels through ages, arrives at remote periods. The virtuous individual displays no gratification in their anguish. He simply watches and records. The destiny of the watchers fulfills an intention beyond their individual condemnation. It creates a precedent, a restriction indicator in the spiritual dimension. Angels who stay devoted observe what resistance requires. Mortals who examine the record comprehend that heavenly statute maintains repercussions even for entities of tremendous strength. The mourning of the watchers resonates through the shadows. It communicates of chances forfeited permanently, of magnificence traded for disgrace, of an unchangeable descent from favor. Their declarations merge into a unified account. Appetite unconstrained produces annihilation. Restrictions exist for significant purposes, and certain decisions possess everlasting significance. Within their anguish, they transform into instructors of the most difficult teachings, not through their understanding, but through their collapse. The immense deluge purifying the planet, moisture accumulates in the atmosphere. Dense, heavy clouds obscure the heavens across the complete earth. For 120 years, cautions have resounded through the populated territories. Noah, a virtuous individual discovered pure within his lineage, has constructed an ark following exact heavenly direction. His community ridiculed him. His neighbors rejected his warnings as insanity. Who could conceive moisture covering the peaks? The Nephilim continue roaming the planet during these closing years. These giants, children of the Watcher's connection with mortal women, have increased in quantity and dominance. Their hungers recognize no limitations. They devour the provisions intended to maintain all living creatures. When the animals and livestock are depleted, when the crops are consumed entirely, they attack humanity directly. Horror becomes the constant existence for common individuals. Mothers and fathers conceal their young. Settlements construct barriers that demonstrate worthlessness against entities of such magnitude and might. Beyond the bodily danger, degradation extends more profoundly still. The instructions of Azazel and his companion watchers have established themselves in mortal civilization. Instruments of combat have become advanced. Peoples clash with each other using bronze blades and iron-pointed weapons. Blood penetrates into the soil continuously. Brutality has become so standard that scarcely anyone recalls a period of tranquility. The practices of magic distribute through concealed institutions. Individuals summon forces they cannot govern. The divisions between the organic and supernatural dimensions become unclear in hazardous methods. Mortal heredity itself displays the indication of degradation. The book of Genesis mentions Noah being perfect within his lineage. This expression possesses importance beyond straightforward moral character. His ancestry stays unmixed with the Nephilim heritage that has distributed through considerable portions of humanity. The combining of celestial and mortal substance has generated something neither completely of paradise nor planet. This hybrid condition insults the actual framework of existence. Heavenly forbearance arrives at its boundary. The cries rising from the planet have received attention. The brutality has received observation. The degradation has received measurement and been discovered intolerable. A determination is reached in the celestial assembly. The endeavor of humanity so damaged by the Watcher's involvement demands a restoration, not a termination, but a purification, not annihilation for its individual purpose, but cleansing with intention. The precipitation commences. Initially, droplets descend like any tempest. Subsequently, the force escalates. Moisture pours from the atmosphere in curtains, in floods, in waterfalls that never stop. However, the precipitation alone does not explain the deluge. Following the Genesis account, the springs of the immense depths explode open. Moisture that existed under the planet's exterior bursts upward. Underground caverns discharge their contents. The world itself appears to be inverting. The Nephilim, regardless of their magnitude and might, cannot endure what arrives next. Moisture climbs above the feet, above the legs, above the torso. It ascends increasingly higher. The giants attempt to flee to higher terrain. They climb slopes and peaks, transporting some mortals as captives or provisions. However, the moisture pursues them. It blankets the tallest summits. 15 cubits above the highest peak, the moisture climbs. Nothing stays without moisture. Nothing endures beyond the ark. The bodily existence of the Nephilim expires in the deluge. These entities who appeared unconquerable encounter their termination in the worldwide flood. Their forms, excessively massive and solid to remain buoyant, descend under the waters. The planet that previously trembled beneath their steps now buries them in deposits of sediment and rock. Coming ages will uncover the remains of giants and question their beginning. Within the ark, Noah and his household perceive the turmoil beyond. The container, constructed following heavenly specification, travels the moisture securely. No breach appears in its structure. No tempest capsizes it. The creatures within stay peaceful regardless of the upheaval. This wooden container becomes the solitary location of existence in a realm of moisture. 8 mortal souls, chosen for their virtue and hereditary purity, signify humanity's continuation. The precipitation persists for 40 days and 40 nights. Moisture controls the terrain for 150 days altogether. Every framework constructed by degraded humanity disintegrates and washes distant. Every structure to the Nephilim dissolves. Every shrine where magic was exercised crumbles into fragments. The planet experiences a total purification, a submersion through moisture that eliminates every indication of the bodily degradation brought by the Watchers. Beyond a natural catastrophe, the deluge functions as a universal restoration. The instructions of Azazel, inscribed on manuscripts and stone tablets, descend under the waters and decompose. The instruments forged following his direction corrode and fragment. The ancestries combining mortal and Nephilim heredity terminate entirely. When the waters withdraw, the planet will be purified, not blameless. The potential for wickedness stays in mortal consciousness, but liberated from the particular degradations brought by celestial uprising. Enoch's record connects these occurrences directly. The deluge arrives as an immediate answer to the Watcher's violation. The giants must receive removal because they signify an abomination against existence's structure. Humanity must be diminished to a virtuous remainder because the degradation has distributed excessively far for any alternative resolution. The planet itself demands purification from the brutality and corruption that saturated it. As the waters reach their peak, blanketing even the tallest peaks, a quietness descends over the realm. The cries of the perishing diminish. The bellows of the drowning Nephilim stop. Only the sound of moisture persists, constant, comprehensive, relentless in its purifying function. This quietness indicates the conclusion of an epoch. The period of the Watcher's immediate influence on Earth terminates in this instant. When the waters ultimately start to withdraw, they abandon a modified realm. Peaks have relocated, ravines have been formed, the terrain itself has transformed. The ark arrives to settle on the peaks of Ararat. Noah dispatches birds to evaluate the waters. Initially a raven, subsequently a dove. When the dove comes back with an olive branch, anticipation comes back with it. Existence will commence again. The deluge achieves its intention. The bodily degradation is eliminated. The Nephilim have departed. Humanity obtains a second opportunity through Noah's household. However, inquiries persist. The watchers themselves remain restrained in their confinements, incapable of acting, but not annihilated. And the essences of the Nephilim, what transforms of them when their forms expire? This inquiry troubles the world, following the deluge, and influences theological comprehension for ages to arrive. The rainbow manifests as a covenant indication. Moisture will never again be employed to purify the complete planet. This commitment provides reassurance, but also indicates that the deluge was a distinctive occurrence, a unique resolution to a particular emergency. The degradation brought by the Watchers demanded such extreme actions. The realm emerges from the waters purified but transformed permanently. The consequences: restraining and confinement. The waters withdraw. Existence commences again on a purified planet. Noah's household steps from the ark onto terrain still moistened from the deluge. Creatures disperse to occupy the vacant territories. Vegetation pushes through the earth, reclaiming the exterior. The bodily realm enters a fresh section. However, in the invisible dimension, a distinct account develops. The rebellious Watchers encounter their ultimate disposition. Enoch's record supplies the most thorough account of their confinement. These entities who came down from paradise now descend more profoundly still into locations prepared particularly for their restraint. Raphael, the archangel assigned with restraining Azazel, fulfills his assignment. The Watcher who instructed humanity in weapon creation and magic discovers himself thrown into Dudale's wilderness. Sharp, uneven rocks encircle him. Shadows blanket his countenance. He cannot perceive, cannot shift, cannot affect the realm above. Azazel's condemnation possesses symbolic importance. He degraded humanity through his instructions. Currently, he remains restrained in a location connected with the scapegoat ceremony that will subsequently develop in Hebrew custom. The corruptions he brought to the realm will in coming ages be symbolically positioned upon a goat and dispatched into the wilderness to Azazel. His identity becomes equivalent with carrying away violation. The remaining Watchers encounter comparable destinies. Following the Enochian texts, they are assembled and restrained collectively. Michael, the principal archangel and fighter of paradise, supervises their confinement. They are thrown into ravines of shadows, into areas where no illumination enters. Certain customs position this prison in the secondary paradise, a dimension between the worldly sphere and the supreme paradise, where the divine resides. Others portray underground chambers profound within the planet itself, where spiritual entities can be limited. The restraints that confine them are not fashioned from metal. Bodily restrictions cannot contain spiritual entities. Rather, these bonds are forged from heavenly decree itself. The pronouncement of verdict becomes their confinement. They stay aware, cognizant, capable of detecting the movement of duration, but entirely incapable of acting. Their strength, previously employed to traverse between dimensions and engage with existence, turns internally against itself. 2 Peter, 2nd section, references these confined angels. The text mentions the divine throwing angels who violated into Tartarus, a Greek expression for the most profound abyss, containing them in restraints of shadows until verdict. This New Testament section, inscribed centuries following Enoch, validates the custom of celestial confinement. The Watchers do not stop existing. They do not obtain immediate ultimate verdict. Rather, they await in restraint for a coming day of accounting. Jude, an additional New Testament author, establishes the connection even more directly. He portrays angels who did not preserve their appropriate domain, but departed their individual residence. These entities currently anticipate the verdict of the immense day, restrained in perpetual restraints beneath shadows. The phrasing resonates Enochian custom nearly precisely. Initial Christian assemblies clearly grasped this account and regarded it as confirmed truth. The position of this prison weighs less than its character. Certain ancient texts identify it as Sheol, though this typically refers to the dimension of mortal deceased. Others designate it the abyss, a bottomless void beyond ordinary existence. Revelation's record subsequently portrays a location where Satan himself will be restrained for 1,000 years, potentially the identical area where the Watchers already remain limited. Terrain in the spiritual dimension operates by distinct principles than worldly maps. Duration moves distinctly in their confinement. A day might seem like 1,000 years. 1,000 years might compress into an instant of consciousness. The Watchers exist in a condition of halted animation, neither completely experiencing duration nor fleeing it. They stay conscious of what they've accomplished. They recall their magnificence. They grasp their descent. This awareness, confined without release, transforms into its individual expression of suffering. The intention of their confinement fulfills numerous purposes. Initially, it extracts them from any additional influence over humanity. Restrained in shadows, they cannot instruct, cannot entice, cannot engage with the bodily realm. The degradation they brought has been eliminated by the deluge. Currently, they themselves must be enclosed to prevent its recurrence. Secondly, their destiny functions as a caution to remaining celestial entities. The heavenly forces observe what resistance requires. Angels who might have considered comparable decisions witness the repercussions in stark expressions. Appetite, unconstrained by compliance, produces everlasting restraint. The magnificence of functioning in heavenly presence far surpasses any temporary satisfaction discovered in violation. Thirdly, their confinement anticipates a coming resolution. They are not restrained perpetually in the meaning of having previously obtained ultimate verdict. Instead, they are contained in custody until the designated period. Enoch's record mentions 70 lineages passing prior to the ultimate accounting. Revelation portrays an immense white throne verdict where all entities will receive evaluation. The Watchers stay in their confinement until that day. Their restraining does not signify they are overlooked. Initial Christian scholars debated their destiny thoroughly. Certain individuals contended they would ultimately be discharged for an ultimate conflict. Others considered their confinement would simply transition to the lake of flames portrayed in apocalyptic literature. Still others proposed they might obtain compassion at the conclusion of all occurrences. However, the texts themselves stayed definite on a single aspect. They are restrained, currently anticipating verdict subsequently. The difference between their initial magnificence and present condition could not be more pronounced. They previously existed in the divine presence. They observed existence's foundations being positioned. They performed at the emergence of celestial bodies. They traveled through dimensions with facility and intention. Currently, they remain in shadows, powerless, isolated from everything they previously understood. The elevation of their descent measures the profundity of their violation. Still, even in confinement, they are not annihilated. Spiritual entities do not expire as mortals do. They persist to exist, albeit in dramatically diminished situations. This continuation raises theological inquiries that resonate through centuries. Why not simply unmake them? Why permit them to persist existing whatsoever? The answers stay intricate, connected to notions of fairness, independent will, and the character of generated entities. The planet above their confinement restores itself. Ages of mortals exist and disappear. Societies emerge and collapse. The understanding of the Watcher's account diminishes from general memory, maintained only in particular texts and customs. However, beneath it all, in spiritual locations beyond ordinary detection, they persist, anticipating, restrained, incapable of fleeing or transforming their destiny. Their confinement exists as one of history's most harsh verdicts, a caution inscribed into the framework of reality itself. The destiny of the Nephilim, the concept of wicked essences. The floodwaters claim every Nephilim form. These giants who frighten the planet with their magnitude and hungers drown together with all remaining physical forms beyond the ark. Their bodily existence descends under the waters, ultimately becoming buried in deposits of sediment. The danger they present to humanity terminates in the flood. However, following ancient texts, especially Enoch's record, expiration resolves only partially the difficulty. Nephilim were hybrid entities, partially mortal through their mothers, partially celestial through their fathers. This dual character generated something unprecedented in existence's structure. Mortals possess forms and essences. Angels exist as pure spiritual entities, absent bodily existence. The Nephilim merged both, and this combination generated a theological emergency that the deluge alone could not address. When mortals expire, their essences have a location. The essence persists in Sheol, or Abraham's dwelling, or whatever dimension anticipates the deceased. The form returns to earth. Expiration supplies a definite transition from worldly existence to whatever arrives next. However, the Nephilim did not pursue this sequence. They were never intended to exist initially. No arrangement had been established for their afterlife. Enoch's record suggests a disturbing resolution to this difficulty. When the Nephilim's forms expired in the deluge, their essences had nowhere to proceed. The ordinary pathways of expiration did not accommodate their hybrid character. They could not rise to paradise. Their celestial heritage arrived through uprising, not virtue. They could not access the mortal dimension of the deceased. They were not completely mortal. Rather, they stayed on earth in a disembodied condition. These essences, currently absent bodily existence, transformed into what subsequent texts would identify as demons or impure essences. They wander the planet seeking to affect humanity. They cannot assume bodily existence themselves, so they pursue to occupy mortal forms. They suggest temptations. They generate spiritual oppression. They function toward recreating the degradation their bodily forms previously embodied. This concept clarifies a continuing difficulty in mortal experience. Why does wickedness persist following the deluge purifying the planet? Why do spiritual forces appear to function against virtue? The Nephilim essences supply an answer. The bodily degradation was eliminated, however the spiritual degradation persisted. These disembodied entities persist the function their fathers initiated, continuing corruption through invisible methods. The New Testament appears to validate this comprehension. When confronting demons, the conversation discloses something considerable. In the Gospel records, impure essences acknowledge heavenly authority instantly. They understand who they encounter. They grasp, verdict anticipates them. Their responses indicate they are not simply fallen angels. Those stay confined following Enoch and Peter. Rather, these are distinct entities, particularly connected to earth and humanity. One encounter demonstrates particularly revealing. A legion of demons occupying an individual implores not to be dispatched into the abyss. They request rather to access a collection of swine. This detail holds significance. If these were fallen angels, they would previously be restrained in the abyss following Enochian custom. However, these essences function on earth, desperate to prevent being thrown from it. Their conduct matches precisely what we would anticipate from Nephilim essences, connected to the worldly dimension, pursuing any bodily existence to occupy, frightened of being dispatched to the location of condemnation. The Book of Jubilees, an additional ancient text from the Second Temple period, develops on this theology. It portrays how the Nephilim essences commenced to direct humanity incorrectly, instantly following the deluge. They degraded Noah's offspring, instructing them the identical prohibited information their fathers held. They motivated idolatry, magic, and brutality. They functioned to undermine the fresh beginning the deluge was intended to supply. Following Jubilees, Noah himself prayed regarding this difficulty. He acknowledged that wicked essences were assaulting his household. He requested that they be restrained and prevented from harming his offspring. The answer was partial. Most of the Nephilim essences were restrained, however 1/10 were permitted to stay liberated beneath the authority of Mastema, a figure comparable to Satan in this text. This persisting 10th would persist to entice and evaluate humanity through all ages. This theology resolved numerous difficulties for ancient Jewish scholars. It clarified why the Watchers were confined, however wickedness persisted. It explained the continuing experience of spiritual conflict. It supplied context for demon occupation and spiritual oppression. It preserved the separation between fallen angels, restrained and functioning wicked essences, liberated to wander. Initial Christian scholars inherited this framework. When Christ expels demons, they grasp these as Nephilim essences. When Paul inscribes regarding spiritual conflict against principalities and authorities, they witness the continuing influence of these disembodied entities. When adherents experience temptation and oppression, they acknowledge the continuation of the Watcher's degradation through these spiritual children. The concept also clarifies why demons pursue to occupy mortals particularly. They previously possessed bodily forms. They experienced the realm through physical substance and circulation. Deprived of that capacity, they desperately pursue to reclaim it through occupation. They favor mortal hosts because of their maternal heritage. They can engage with the bodily realm only through borrowed forms. Certain ancient texts portray a hierarchy within these essences. Those descended from the most dominant Nephilim transformed into more influential demons. Lesser essences originated from lesser giants. They structured themselves, generating systems of spiritual corruption that reflected worldly authority frameworks. This invisible kingdom functions constantly against heavenly intentions. The implications extend through all of following history. Every act of occupation, every spiritual conflict, every temptation toward prohibited information connects to Mount Hermon. The pledge promised by the Watchers persists to produce results through their descendants. The disembodied essences of the Nephilim. The degradation brought prior to the deluge was not entirely eliminated. It modified into something more treacherous, more difficult to oppose, and impossible to flee through bodily methods alone. This comprehension influences approaches to spiritual conflict even currently. If demons are Nephilim essences, then they possess the identical rebellious character as their fathers. They hold information beyond mortal comprehension. They recall the period prior to the deluge. They grasp celestial operations. They function with intention and intelligence to degrade humanity precisely as their fathers accomplished. The deluge resolved the bodily emergency. The planet was purified of giant forms and combined bloodlines. However, the spiritual emergency persists. The Nephilim, though deceased, stay functioning through their disembodied essences. Their influence pervades mortal history, an invisible contagion more hazardous than their bodily presence ever was. They cannot be drowned. They cannot be confined like their fathers. They can only be opposed, reprimanded, and ultimately defeated by greater spiritual authority. The heritage of Azazel, the scapegoat ceremony. Centuries move following the deluge. Abraham's offspring multiply in the territory of commitment. They experience captivity in the ancient territories of the East, then obtain liberation through heavenly involvement. In the wilderness, they obtain the statute, thorough directions for veneration, assembly, and virtue. Within these directions, one ceremony stands prominent for its immediate connection to the Watcher's account. The Day of Reconciliation, identified as Yom Kippur in Hebrew, transforms into the most consecrated day in the ceremonial calendar. On this day, the chief priest executes ceremonies to purify the populace of their accumulated corruptions. Circulation is released, incense is combusted, supplications are presented. However, the ceremony's most remarkable component involves 2 goats and an identity that resonates from prior to the deluge. Leviticus 16th section portrays the procedure. The chief priest claims 2 goats of equivalent worth. Selections are thrown over them, establishing their individual destinies. 1 goat is offered to the divine, its circulation brought into the most consecrated location to establish reconciliation. The remaining goat obtains a distinct treatment. The chief priest positions both hands upon its head, acknowledging all the corruptions and violations of the populace. Subsequently, this goat is directed into the wilderness by a designated individual. It is dispatched away, transporting the populace's responsibility into a distant and uninhabited location. The text identifies the location. The goat is dispatched to Azazel. This Hebrew expression has generated centuries of scholarly discussion. Certain individuals translate it as the goat that departs, or for total extraction. However, the most ancient Jewish comprehension regards Azazel as a proper identity, the identity of a particular entity connected with the wilderness and with corruption itself. Enoch's record supplies the connection. Azazel was among the principal watchers, perhaps secondary only to Semyaza in influence. He instructed humanity in the creation of instruments and decorations. He disclosed the mysteries of beautification products and metallurgy. He brought magic and the severing of roots. His instructions degraded mortal civilization, producing immediately to the brutality that required the deluge. Following the flood, Raphael, the archangel, restrained Azazel in Dudael's wilderness. Sharp rocks encircled him. Shadows blanketed him. He persisted there, confined, carrying the burden of the degradation he brought. The scapegoat ceremony established through Moses literally dispatches the populace's corruptions to where Azazel remains restrained. The corruptions he instructed mortals to perform are symbolically returned to him. This generates a significant theological declaration. Corruption does not begin with humanity. The impulse toward uprising exists certainly, however particular degradations connect to particular origins. Azazel brought certain wickedness into mortal civilization. The Day of Reconciliation recognizes this reality. By dispatching the corruption-carrying goat to Azazel, the ceremony announces that these degradations are being returned to their origin. The symbolism extends more profoundly still. Two goats, nearly identical, obtain opposite destinies. One is killed, its circulation establishing reconciliation. The remaining exists but is exiled, transporting away impurity. This dual approach addresses two aspects of corruption, its penalty and its presence. Circulation addresses the penalty, satisfying fairness. The scapegoat extracts the presence, transporting defilement distant from the assembly. Azazel's function in this ceremony indicates him uniquely within the fallen watchers. The others are confined, absent, continuing ceremonial recognition. However, Azazel's identity is communicated annually by the chief priest. His connection to corruption is commemorated in the most consecrated ceremony. He transforms, in a meaning, the patron demon of mortal degradation, not because he governs over it, but because he brought it. Subsequent Jewish inscriptions develop on this custom. The Book of Jubilees portrays how demons, Nephilim essences, persisted to degrade humanity following the deluge beneath the command of Mastema. However, Mastema's authority connects through the Watchers to their initial uprising. Azazel's confinement functions as a reminder that these degrading forces have received identification and verdict, even if their influence continues. The scapegoat itself transforms into a dominant image in religious contemplation. It carries corruption it did not perform. It is dispatched distant from the assembly, though it is blameless. It transports the burden of shared responsibility into the wilderness. These themes resonate through subsequent theological development, discovering their most complete expression in Christian comprehension of substitutionary reconciliation. The ceremony also creates a sequence for addressing spiritual degradation. Bodily offering addresses the penalty of corruption. Symbolic exile extracts its presence. Both are required. Both function collectively. The circulation purifies. The scapegoat transports distant. Humanity cannot simply be pardoned. The degradation must be extracted from the settlement entirely. Certain ancient origins portray what occurred to the scapegoat following it was directed into the wilderness. Customs vary. However, many propose it was directed to a precipice and pushed over, guaranteeing it could never return. Whether or not this was actual practice, the symbolism is definite. The corruptions transported into the wilderness must not return. They are expelled permanently, extracted from the assembly as comprehensively as achievable. Azazel, restrained in Dudael, obtains these corruptions annually in ceremonial expression. Year following year, the chief priest acknowledges the populace's violations over a goat dispatched to his identity. He experiences a yearly reminder of his violation. He degraded humanity, and currently humanity's degradation is returned to him symbolically. His condemnation encompasses carrying observation to the continuing effects of his uprising. The Day of Reconciliation, beyond any remaining ceremony, recognizes the reality of spiritual degradation from exterior origins. Remaining offerings address mortal failings. The scapegoat ceremony directly addresses the category of degradation brought by the Watchers. It acknowledges that certain wickedness arrived from beyond humanity and must be addressed distinctly. This comprehension influences how subsequent ages approach spiritual conflict. Wickedness is not simply internal. Degradation possesses exterior origins that must receive attention. Pardon alone is inadequate if the degrading influence stays functioning. Extraction, restraining, and exile transform into required components of addressing spiritual wickedness. The heritage of Azazel thus exists in one of humanity's most consecrated ceremonies. His identity is communicated in the most sacred context, not as recognition, but as identification. He is identified, so his degradation can receive attention. He is recalled so his influence can be opposed. The scapegoat transports mortal corruption into the wilderness, to the location where this specific strain of degradation began. Fairness is fulfilled, structure is preserved. The assembly is purified through a ceremony that recognizes both mortal accountability and exterior degradation. Resonances in Canaan. The Rephaim and Anakim, ages move following the deluge. Noah's offspring distribute across the planet, establishing peoples and civilizations. Abraham obtains a commitment. His children will possess a particular territory, a region flowing with abundance and favor. However, this territory is not vacant. When the period arrives for possession, Abraham's offspring uncover something troubling. Giants still traverse the planet. The 12 observers dispatched by Moses to examine the committed territory return with accounts that generate fear into the populace's consciousness. 10 of the 12 portray settlements with barriers ascending toward the atmosphere. More alarming, they communicate of giants, individuals of such magnitude that the Israelites sensed like insects in comparison. These entities are identified particularly as Anakim, offspring of Anak, and connected to a broader collection identified as the Rephaim. The Book of Numbers documents their fearful account. The territory devours its occupants. They assert the inhabitants are individuals of immense proportions. We observed the Nephilim present. The offspring of Anak originate from the Nephilim. We appeared like insects in our personal perception, and we seemed identical to them. This declaration immediately connects the giants following the deluge to the pre-deluge Nephilim. How can this occur? The deluge annihilated all physical forms except those within the ark. Noah and his household possessed no Nephilim heredity following the record. The giants should have received complete elimination. Still here they exist centuries, subsequently occupying the precise territory committed to Abraham's offspring. Multiple concepts arise from ancient texts to clarify this seeming inconsistency. The Book of Genesis states that Nephilim existed on the planet in those periods and also following. That expression, "and also following," implies a secondary occurrence. Certain customs maintain that following the deluge particular watchers or their influence appeared again, though not on the identical magnitude as previously. The Nephilim essences left wandering following the deluge might have discovered methods to generate comparable offspring through more subtle degradation. An alternative clarification concentrates on heredity. Perhaps the deluge did not completely eradicate the Nephilim ancestry. While Noah himself was pure, certain individuals propose that one of his son's spouses might have possessed recessive giant heredity. This concept stays debatable and lacks definite textual foundation, yet it endeavors to explain the re-emergence of giants through organic descent instead of supernatural involvement. The Rephaim signify an ancient people of giants, repeatedly stated in biblical texts. They occupied areas east of the Jordan River, in territories subsequently recognized as Bashan and Moab. Their designation becomes equivalent with both bodily giants and the essences of the deceased in certain sections, generating a linguistic connection between them and the Nephilim essences concept. King Og of Bashan exists as perhaps the most renowned Rephaim in biblical history. Deuteronomy portrays his bed as measuring 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in width, approximately 13 feet by 6 feet. This tremendous piece of furniture was fashioned from iron and maintained on exhibition, proposing Og's magnitude was exceptional even within his individual populace. When the Israelites ultimately overcome him, it indicates a considerable triumph over the remnant of the Rephaim in that area. The Anakim particularly frightened the Israelites throughout the conquest period. They occupy the hill territory of Canaan, especially surrounding Hebron. Their fortified settlements and fearsome standing cause the populace to question heavenly commitments. Caleb, among the devoted observers, ultimately conquers Hebron and expels the 3 sons of Anak. This triumph becomes representative of faith, conquering fear, of heavenly commitment, demonstrating stronger than bodily intimidation. David's confrontation with Goliath supplies the most renowned giant account. This Philistine champion stands exceeding 9 feet in height, wears armor weighing 125 pounds, and possesses a spear with a 15-pound iron tip. He signifies the Rephaim ancestry through his connection to Gath, a settlement recognized for generating giants. When young David strikes him down with a solitary stone, the triumph resonates beyond military accomplishment. It proves that the giant ancestry, however it endured the deluge, stays subject to heavenly intention. The biblical texts regard these giants, following the deluge, as remnants demanding elimination. Their presence in the committed territory is not accidental. They signify a continuation of the pre-deluge degradation, a continuing challenge that must receive conquest for the heavenly plan to progress. Every triumph over giants becomes a small magnitude reenactment of the deluge's intention, extracting degradation so virtue can flourish. Geographic sequences emerge in the giant accounts. They concentrate in particular areas, especially the hill territory and the territories east of the Jordan. They create fortified locations in zones of strategic significance. Their presence appears intended to obstruct the realization of heavenly commitments. Whether through supernatural reintroduction or hereditary endurance, their re-emergence fulfills an intention in the larger account, evaluating faith and demanding active involvement in conquering wickedness. The total elimination of these giant peoples requires ages. Joshua's conquest extracts numerous, but not all, Judges documents continuing conflicts with giant clans. David's period witnesses the ultimate mentions of Rephaim fighters. By the period of subsequent kings, giants vanish from the biblical account. Their ancestry, whether through combat or organic decline, diminishes from mortal heredity. Certain customs connect these giants following the deluge immediately to the Nephilim essences. Perhaps disembodied essences of the initial giants discovered methods to affect mortal heredity again, generating approximations of their previous bodily magnificence. This would clarify both their comparable characteristics and their ultimate elimination. They were never genuine Nephilim, simply influenced by Nephilim essences attempting to recreate what was forfeited. The theological importance of these giants cannot receive overstatement. They demonstrate that the conflict initiated prior to the deluge persists following it. Bodily purification extracted the initial degradation. However, the spiritual forces behind that degradation stay functioning. They cannot recreate the precise conditions of the pre-deluge realm, yet they can generate resonances of it. The giants of Canaan signify persistence of wickedness, adaptation of degradation, and the continuing requirement for vigilance against spiritual dangers. The conquest accounts acquire deeper significance in this illumination. The Israelites are not simply claiming territory, they are continuing the function initiated in the deluge, extracting degradation from the planet. Every giant overcome signifies another triumph over the heritage of the Watchers. Every fortified settlement claimed from Anakim governance restores a portion of existence to its appropriate structure. The connection between the Anakim, Rephaim, and initial Nephilim generates a thread through biblical history. From the Watchers coming down to David's victory over Goliath, the account stays consistent. Giants signify degradation of the generated structure. They emerge from prohibited connections or spiritual influence. They endanger humanity and resist heavenly intentions. And they must receive conquest through faith merged with action. The Watchers in the wilderness, the corruption at Baal Peor. The wilderness journey approaches its conclusion. The generation that departed captivity in the eastern territories has expired in the wilderness, condemned for their faithlessness at Kadesh. Their offspring currently exist on the border of the committed territory, settled in the plains of Moab. 40 years of wandering are nearly finished. Triumph appears within grasp. Subsequently arrives a temptation that resonates the ancient corruption of the Watchers. The occurrence at Baal Peor signifies among the most shadowed instances in the wilderness account. The individuals commence to involve themselves with Moabite women. Initially, this might appear like straightforward attraction between communities. The Moabites possess daughters. The Israelite individuals notice them. Mortal nature pursues its pattern. However, the circumstance rapidly discloses itself as something far more treacherous. These connections are not simply romantic or bodily. They possess spiritual consequences. The Moabite women summon the Israelite individuals to offerings honoring their deities. The individuals participate in these ceremonies. They prostrate before Baal of Peor, a regional deity connected with fertility practices and intimate ceremonies. The veneration involves acts that transgress every restriction created in the statute provided at Sinai. Numbers 25 portrays the development. Initially arrives attraction, subsequently arrives bodily connection, subsequently arrives involvement in foreign veneration, subsequently arrives complete apostasy. The individuals are not simply marrying beyond their populace. They are deserting their covenant association with the divine. They are exchanging everlasting commitments for immediate satisfaction. The correspondence to Mount Hermon becomes definite. The Watchers observed mortal women and discovered them attractive. They came down from their appropriate dimension to claim them as spouses. This act of restriction, transgression, produced degradation, prohibited information, and ultimately verdict. Currently, centuries subsequently, Israelite individuals traverse restrictions with foreign women. Bodily attraction produces spiritual compromise. Connection with those beyond the covenant generates degradation within the assembly. Certain ancient interpreters examine this occurrence as beyond mortal failing. They witness evidence of spiritual entities functioning behind the circumstances. The Nephilim essences, still functioning following the deluge, would organically pursue to degrade the populace through whom heavenly commitments would receive realization. If they could penetrate the covenant assembly through intimate connection with foreigners, they could reproduce their initial degradation in a fresh expression. The Moabite women in this interpretation were not acting autonomously. They were affected or occupied by essences pursuing to recreate the pre-deluge sequence. The fertility cult of Baal Peor supplied a perfect instrument. Intimate acts executed as veneration generated a spiritual opening. Restrictions dissolved in ceremonial ecstasy. The Israelite individuals, drawn by bodily appetite, walked into a snare that endangered the complete nation's hereditary and spiritual purity. The answer demonstrates swift and harsh. A plague erupts within the populace. 24,000 expire before it terminates. Phinehas, grandson of Aaron, assumes decisive action when he observes an Israelite individual brazenly transporting a Midianite woman into the settlement. He pursues them into their tent and executes them both. This act of zealous verdict halts the plague and is calculated to Phinehas as virtue. The harshness of the condemnation reflects the harshness of the danger. This was not straightforward disobedience. This was existential peril. The covenant assembly encountered the identical degradation that annihilated the pre-deluge realm. Intimate connection with those dedicated to foreign deities could generate offspring possessing spiritual contamination. The hereditary purity that rendered Noah's household suitable to endure the deluge encountered compromise in Noah's offspring. Moses obtained particular directions following the occurrence. The leaders who directed the populace into this corruption must encounter verdict. Combat is announced against the Midianites who cooperated with Moab to seduce the Israelites. The message resonates definite. Restrictions hold significance. Separation from degrading influences is not discretionary. The teachings of the Watcher's descent must receive remembrance and application. Subsequent biblical authors reference Baal Peor as a cautionary account. Hosea states it when portraying the spiritual adultery that characterized the northern kingdom. The Psalm authors recall it as an illustration of uprising that delivered heavenly anger. The occurrence becomes shorthand for the peril of intimate and spiritual compromise merged. The connection to the Watcher's corruption operates on numerous dimensions. Both involve improper, intimate connections. Both traverse restrictions intended to preserve separation. Both produce spiritual degradation, distributing through an assembly. Both demand dramatic heavenly involvement to halt. Both result in harsh verdict that appears severe until grasped in universal context. The fertility cult aspect contributes another dimension. Baal veneration involved shrine, prostitution, and ceremonial intimate acts intended to promote agricultural and mortal fertility. This perverted the contribution of intimacy, transforming it from covenant favor into idolatrous manipulation. The Watchers comparably perverted their character by claiming mortal spouses. They modified something beneficial, appreciation of attractiveness, into prohibited appetite that transgressed generated structure. Certain scholars propose the Moabite and Midianite women were not simply mortal. They theorized that these women possessed Nephilim heredity, perhaps from the Anakim or Rephaim ancestries recognized to exist in the area. The attraction Israelite individuals experienced might have been supernaturally enhanced. The children of such connections would recreate the hybrid entities that required the deluge. Whether or not this hereditary concept maintains, the spiritual reality stays definite. The occurrence at Baal Peor signified an endeavor to degrade the covenant populace through intimate connection with those devoted to deceptive deities. The sequence created by the Watchers was receiving repetition. Foreign women transformed into the instrument for spiritual penetration. Appetite opened the pathway to apostasy. Bodily connection produced veneration of demons. The verdict that pursued restored restrictions. Those who transgressed the separation expired. Combat eradicated the origin of temptation. The enduring assembly renewed their covenant dedication. They acquired again the teaching inscribed in the celestial bodies and formed into history by the deluge. Certain restrictions must never receive crossing. Intimate connection possesses spiritual consequences. Purity of veneration demands separation from degrading influences. The wilderness functions as setting for both Mount Hermon's pledge and Baal Peor's corruption. In wilderness locations distant from civilization's constraints, temptation assumes particular expressions. The isolation amplifies appetite. The absence of framework weakens determination. Both the Watchers and the Israelite individuals established their fateful decisions in liminal spaces between created dimensions where restrictions appeared less established. Baal Peor exists as a caution. The Watcher's sequence can repeat. Mortal character stays vulnerable to the identical temptations that caused angels to descend. Intimate appetite, however organic, can transform into the instrument for spiritual degradation when directed toward prohibited connections. Vigilance is demanded. Restrictions must receive preservation. The resonances of Mount Hermon reverberate through history, and those who overlook its teaching risk repeating its repercussions. The apocalyptic custom, the Watchers in Daniel, duration progresses. The covenant populace experiences cycles of devotion and uprising. Judges yield to kings. The United Kingdom divides. Ultimately, both northern and southern kingdoms descend to foreign authorities. The populace discovers themselves in exile, distant from the committed territory, subjects of empires that venerate strange deities. In this context of displacement and longing, a fresh expression of literature emerges: apocalyptic disclosure. Daniel, a virtuous individual functioning in the Babylonian court, obtains visions that withdraw the covering on spiritual realities. These disclosures employ symbolic language, vivid imagery, and universal scope to disclose truths regarding heavenly intentions and spiritual conflict. Within the entities manifesting in his visions, a familiar expression resurfaces: watchers. However, here, the designation possesses a modified significance. In Daniel's 4th section, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar portrays a dream. He observes a tremendous tree ascending toward paradise, visible to the extremities of the planet. Subsequently, a sacred one, a watcher, comes down from paradise with a declaration: the tree will receive cutting. The king will be expelled from mortal society to exist with wild creatures until he recognizes that the Most High governs over mortal kingdoms. The Watcher's decree receives execution precisely as declared. This Watcher functions as an agent of heavenly verdict, not uprising. The expression has received reclamation, modified from its connection with the fallen angels of Enoch to portray a category of sacred angels who observe over mortal affairs and implement heavenly decrees. They stay vigilant, watching the actions of worldly rulers, prepared to accomplish celestial determinations. The modification of the expression reflects theological development. The initial custom recalled the Watchers as the 200 who came down to Mount Hermon. Their designation became equivalent with uprising and degradation. However, the fundamental significance, those who observe, who stay vigilant, possessed no inherent wickedness. The notion of heavenly entities watching mortal affairs predated the particular uprising portrayed in Enoch. Daniel's employment reclaims and purifies the expression. Affirmative, certain watchers descended. However, the office itself stays valid. Sacred angels still observe over existence. They watch the pride of kings and the anguish of the virtuous. They convey messages and implement verdicts. They participate in the heavenly assembly where determinations affecting planet receive establishment. The fallen watchers betrayed their intention, however virtuous watchers persist fulfilling it. This separation becomes essential in Jewish angelology as it develops throughout and following the exile. Angels receive organization into hierarchies and categories. Certain function as messengers, others operate as fighters. Still, others preserve universal structure. The watchers signify those who particularly watch and report, who bridge the gap between celestial understanding and worldly occurrences. The Book of Daniel subsequently portrays a vision of the heavenly throne chamber. The Ancient of Days assumes his seat. Thousands upon thousands attend him. 10,000 times 10,000 exist before him. Records receive opening. Verdict receives establishment. This universal courtroom scene proposes a vast celestial bureaucracy with distinct orders of angels fulfilling particular functions. The watchers would be those who supply testimony, who report on what they have watched. This framework affects how subsequent ages comprehend spiritual conflict. The fallen watchers and their Nephilim essence children function to degrade humanity. However, sacred watchers watch their activities and report to the heavenly assembly. They preserve surveillance over both mortal and spiritual affairs. They guarantee that violations do not proceed unnoticed, that wickedness does not function absent observation. The modification also addresses a linguistic difficulty. The Hebrew expression ear literally signifies watcher or wakeful one. Prohibiting the expression completely because of the fallen angels would eradicate a completely beneficial designation for sacred angels who do observe. Daniel's employment maintains the expression while distinctly separating between devoted and rebellious watchers. Subsequent apocalyptic literature constructs on Daniel's foundation. The Book of Jubilees states watchers who stayed devoted, who observed in horror as their companions came down to degradation. These sacred watchers reported the uprising to the Most High. They participated in the verdict that pursued. They assisted in restraining the fallen ones. Their watchfulness functioned virtue instead of appetite. The New Testament reflects this developed comprehension. References to angels watching mortal affairs manifest throughout. Paul inscribes that apostles have transformed into a spectacle to angels. Peter states that angels long to examine into the secrets of salvation. The author of Hebrews proposes we are encircled by a cloud of observers. These sections assume celestial entities actively watching mortal occurrences. The difference between sacred and fallen watchers transforms into a model for comprehending all spiritual conflict. Both sides hold comparable capabilities. Both can watch. Both can engage with existence to a certain degree. However, their intentions diverge entirely. Sacred watchers function heavenly intentions. Fallen watchers pursue their individual appetites. Sacred watchers preserve restrictions. Fallen watchers transgress them. Daniel's visions also brought the notion of territorial angels, spiritual entities assigned to particular peoples and areas. The Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece manifest as entities who oppose or support heavenly intentions. These may signify another category of watchers, those whose vigilance extends over geopolitical affairs. When they stay devoted, they cooperate with Paradise's plans. When they rebel, they transform into obstacles demanding archangelic involvement. The Book of Enoch, while preserving its record of the fallen watchers, also recognizes sacred ones who did not come down. These devoted watchers persist their designated rounds. They watch the confined rebels. They observe the continuing effects of that ancient uprising. They exist as evidence that celestial independent will can select compliance as certainly as it can select uprising. This theological development functions practical intentions. Assemblies in exile require to understand that Paradise still observes. Anguishing, virtuous populace require assurance that their circumstance has obtained observation. Those encountering oppression from dominant worldly rulers require to consider that spiritual authorities indicate these injustices. The sacred watchers supply this assurance. The expression thus possesses dual significance in Jewish and Christian custom. In historical records of the uprising, watchers references the fallen angels and their commander. In apocalyptic and devotional contexts, watchers portrays sacred angels fulfilling their appropriate operation. Context establishes significance. Both employments stay valid within their individual frameworks. Daniel's apocalyptic visions prove that not all who observe have descended. Vigilance itself is not degraded, only particular vigilant ones. The office stays sacred even when particular office possessors betray their trust. This principle applies beyond angelology to all locations of accountability and trust. Betrayal by certain individuals does not invalidate the legitimate authority of others. The reclaimed expression watcher thus transforms into a reminder. Those who watch carry accountability for what they accomplish with that watching. The fallen watchers observed mortal women and acted on prohibited appetite. Sacred watchers observe mortal anguish and report to the heavenly throne. Both observe, both perceive, however their answers diverge entirely, and in that divergence exists the distinction between magnificence and disgrace, function and uprising, everlasting recognition and everlasting confinement. New Testament shadows, the sons of the divine and the wilderness. The ancient accounts discover fresh relevance as the committed Messiah traverses the planet. The individual from Nazareth travels through the territories previously occupied by giants. He preaches in areas where the Watcher's influence departed, lasting indicators, and in his confrontations with spiritual forces, resonances of that primordial uprising resurface. The wilderness transforms into a considerable setting. Following his baptism, the essence expels him into the wilderness, the identical wilderness where Azazel remains restrained, where the scapegoat received dispatch, where temptation assumes its most concentrated expression. For 40 days, he encounters evaluation. The adversary himself manifests, presenting kingdoms, challenging identity, distorting scripture. This confrontation in the wilderness connects immediately to the spiritual terrain created by the Watcher's verdict. Subsequently arrives the ministry within populace. Settlement following settlement, he confronts individuals occupied by impure essences. These entities acknowledge him instantly. They understand who he is. They grasp his authority. Their responses disclose essential information regarding their character and beginning. They are not simply fallen angels. Those stay confined following Enochian custom. These are distinct entities, connected particularly to Earth and humanity. In a single confrontation, an essence identifies itself as legion, indicating multiplicity. These demons implore not to be dispatched into the abyss. They request permission to access a collection of swine, rather. This detail holds significance considerably. If these were fallen angels, they would previously be in the abyss, following created custom. Their fear of receiving dispatch there proposes they presently function with certain degree of liberty on planet. This matches precisely the Nephilim essence concept, disembodied children of the Watchers, wandering planet pursuing forms to occupy. The Gospel authors consistently portray these essences as impure. This particular designation connects to purity statutes and spiritual defilement. The Nephilim were products of prohibited connection, hybrid entities that transgressed existence's categories. Their essences would organically be regarded impure, fitting neither mortal nor celestial categories, contaminated by their precise beginning. When confronted, these essences frequently communicate of suffering and verdict. They acknowledge that a day of accounting approaches. They comprehend they function on borrowed duration. Their existence on planet is temporary permission, not permanent entitlement. This theology aligns with the Jubilee's custom. Most Nephilim essences received restraint following the deluge. However, certain stayed liberated to evaluate and entice humanity until ultimate verdict. The Apostle Paul develops a framework for comprehending spiritual conflict that assumes numerous dimensions of wicked entities. He inscribes of principalities and authorities, governors of shadows, spiritual forces of corruption in celestial locations. This hierarchy proposes distinct categories of spiritual entities resisting heavenly intentions. At the lowest dimension, impure essences afflict individuals. Higher positioned territorial authorities affect areas and peoples. All connect their uprising to that initial coming down. Peter's initial epistle possesses a puzzling section that initial Christian assemblies grasped as referencing the Watchers. He portrays how the Messiah, following his expiration, proceeded and preached to the essences in confinement. Those who were disobedient long previously, when heavenly forbearance anticipated in the periods of Noah, these confined essences appear clearly to be the fallen Watchers restrained in their shadows since prior to the deluge, currently obtaining declaration of their total defeat. The secondary epistle attributed to Peter establishes the connection even more directly. He inscribes of angels who violated and received throwing into Tartarus, reserved in restraints of shadows for verdict. He connects this immediately to the deluge account, portraying how the ancient realm received annihilation while Noah received preservation. The sequence matches Enochian custom completely. Angels violated through prohibited connection, delivered degradation, received confinement, and anticipate ultimate verdict. Jude, in his brief letter, references the record immediately. He states angels who did not preserve their appropriate dwelling location, but deserted their individual habitation. These currently anticipate the verdict of the immense day, restrained in perpetual restraints beneath shadows. He connects this to Sodom and Gomorrah, noting that these settlements comparably yielded themselves to intimate immorality and pursued strange physical form. The correspondence is deliberate. Both the angels and Sodom's occupants transgressed organic restrictions in their pursuit of prohibited intimate connection. These New Testament references assume their audience understands the fuller account. The authors do not clarify the details because initial Christian assemblies were familiar with Enochian custom. They examined the Book of Enoch. They grasped the Watcher's account. They acknowledged the continuing effects of that ancient uprising in the spiritual conflict they experienced constantly. The ministry of liberation from demonic occupation assumes deeper significance in this context. Every essence expelled signifies a small triumph over the heritage of the Watchers. Every individual liberated from oppression pushes against the degradation brought prior to the deluge. The kingdom, penetrating into history, immediately challenges the unauthorized spiritual kingdom created by the Nephilim essences. Paul's directions regarding spiritual armor establish meaning within this framework. Adherents wrestle not against physical substance and circulation, however against spiritual entities with intelligence, structure, and malicious intention. These are not abstract forces, however actual entities, the disembodied essences of hybrid giants still pursuing to degrade and annihilate humanity as their bodily expressions previously accomplished. The wilderness persists to function as a position of spiritual importance throughout these records. Impure essences, when expelled, wander through waterless locations, pursuing rest. They discover none and endeavor to return to their previous habitation. This detail reinforces their earthbound character. They are not liberated to wander all dimensions like sacred angels. They stay connected to the bodily realm, desperate for embodiment, wandering the identical wildernesses where their fathers previously traversed as giants. The theological framework that emerges regards the Watcher's uprising as the foundational spiritual catastrophe. Mortal corruption stems from mortal will, certainly. However, it functions within a context influenced by that prior celestial uprising. The degradation brought by the Watchers and continued by Nephilim essences generates an environment where mortal corruption discovers supernatural reinforcement. Triumph over these forces arrives through spiritual authority established in heavenly strength. The Messiah proves this authority in his worldly ministry. His adherents obtain delegated authority to persist the function. Every demon expelled, every individual conveyed, every spiritual stronghold fragmented signifies continuing application of the triumph achieved over the Watcher's heritage. The New Testament thus validates and constructs upon ancient custom instead of replacing it. The Watchers stay confined. Their spiritual children persist to plague humanity. However, currently a greater strength has accessed history, one capable of addressing not simply symptoms, however fundamental causes. The wilderness, previously the location of Azazel's restraining, transforms into the location where temptation receives perfect resistance ultimately. The essences who considered themselves secure in their functions discover themselves suddenly powerless before commanding authority. An enduring mythos, from ancient text to modern contemplation, the account that initiated on Mount Hermon refuses to diminish. Millennia following the deluge, centuries following the conquest, ages beyond the initial century, the record of the Watchers persists to captivate mortal imagination. What commenced as oral custom crystallized into Enochian literature and resonated through biblical texts currently influences Western civilization in methods both apparent and subtle. Initial church fathers grappled thoroughly with the Watcher's account. Justin Martyr, inscribing in the 2nd century, regarded the account as literal history. He considered angels genuinely came down, claimed mortal spouses, and generated giant children. These children transformed into demons following their bodily annihilation. For Justin, this clarified the beginning of pagan deities. They were either Watchers or Nephilim essences, obtaining veneration intended for the genuine divine. Tertullian, an additional initial Christian author, connected the Watcher's instruction to continuing difficulties in his period. When he contended against women wearing beautification products and jewelry, he connected these practices immediately to Azazel's prohibited direction. The decorations women employed to enhance attractiveness were, in his perspective, instruments instructed by fallen angels to facilitate seduction and moral degradation. He witnessed cultural practices as possessing forward the Watcher's influence. Clement of Alexandria assumed a more allegorical approach, absent, completely dismissing the literal examination. He witnessed the Watchers as signifying improper descent of spiritual consciousness into material concerns. The claiming of spouses symbolized the essence's entanglement with bodily satisfactions. Still, even in his symbolic examination, Clement recognized that something historically considerable occurred that the account maintained. As Christianity transformed into the controlling religion of the empire, the Watcher's account commenced to encounter official skepticism. Church assemblies debated which texts possessed scriptural authority. The Book of Enoch, while widely examined and quoted by initial adherents, did not establish the ultimate canonical selection in most Christian customs. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained it as scripture. Elsewhere, it relocated from sacred text to interesting, however non-authoritative literature. This canonical exclusion did not terminate the account's influence. Medieval scholars persisted referencing it when discussing the beginning of demons. They developed elaborate systems of demonology that assumed Nephilim essences, fashioned the lower ranks of Inferno's hierarchy. Grimoires and magical texts asserted to document the identities of particular fallen watchers and methods for summoning or restraining them. The Renaissance delivered renewed interest in ancient texts and esoteric understanding. Scholars recovered Greek and Latin manuscripts. They translated Hebrew and Aramaic documents. Enoch emerged from obscurity. Intellectuals fascinated by Hermeticism and mysticism witnessed in the Watcher's instruction a model for prohibited understanding that could provide strength. The angels who disclosed celestial mysteries transformed into, for certain individuals, aspirational figures instead of cautionary accounts. John Milton's Paradise Lost contacted on the Watcher's custom, though he concentrated primarily on Satan's uprising. Still, his poetic treatment of celestial descent affected how following ages imagined these occurrences. The concept of angels selecting to desert paradise for worldly appetites discovered beautiful and tragic expression in his verse. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason temporarily diminished interest in celestial mythology. However, Romanticism delivered its surging return. Poets and authors witnessed in the Watcher's descent a reflection of mortal longing for prohibited experience. The angel who loved excessively, profoundly, who selected planet over paradise, transformed into a figure of sympathy instead of verdict. The uprising modified from universal crime to noble offering. Modern archaeology has added unexpected components to the discussion. The discovery of ancient locations, especially in areas stated in Enochian terrain, generated speculation. Mount Hermon itself transformed into a pilgrimage location for certain individuals. Ruins of megalithic frameworks in various positions received attribution to Nephilim construction. While mainstream archaeology presents more prosaic clarifications, alternative concepts connecting ancient secrets to the Watchers obtained popular followings. The 20th century witnessed the Watchers access popular civilization through literature and film. Science fiction authors reinterpreted the account as ancient astronaut visitation. The sons of the divine transformed into extraterrestrial entities. The Nephilim received clarification as hybrid children of mortal alien hereditary experimentation. These retellings removed supernatural components while maintaining the account framework. Dominant entities come down, engage with mortals, generate extraordinary children, encounter verdict. Fantasy literature embraced the notion of fallen angels and their lingering influence. Innumerable novels feature demons or shadow entities, with beginnings connecting to primordial uprising. Video games position players as fighters, combating against forces that resonate Nephilim essences. The fundamental sequence, ancient degradation continues, demands continuing opposition, demonstrates endlessly adaptable to fresh media. Conspiracy concepts have integrated the Watchers into grand accounts regarding concealed history and secret understanding. Certain individuals assert that ancestries descended from Nephilim still exist, governing world occurrences from behind the circumstances. Others propose that prohibited understanding instructed by the Watchers has received preservation by secret societies and conveyed through initiatic customs. These concepts, while lacking historical evidence, prove the account's persisting strength to influence how populace comprehend concealed realities. New Age spirituality has sometimes inverted the customary moral framework. Instead of perceiving the Watchers as rebellious, certain individuals reinterpret them as liberators who provided humanity understanding that a tyrannical deity desired to withhold. Azazel transforms into Prometheus, delivering enlightenment instead of degradation. This examination modifies the account from a caution regarding violation into a celebration of understanding, pursuing, and restriction traversing. Academic examination of the Watchers' custom has intensified in recent decades. Scholars investigate the historical development of the texts, their association to remaining ancient Near Eastern mythology, and their influence on subsequent religious contemplation. The Dead Sea Scrolls supplied additional Enochian manuscripts, validating the account's significance in Second Temple Judaism. Comparative mythology discloses comparable accounts in remaining civilizations, heavenly entities coming down, combining with mortals, generating heroes or monsters. The psychological interpretation regards the Watchers as signifying aspects of mortal awareness. The descent symbolizes the incarnation of essence into material. The prohibited understanding signifies the hazardous strength of unconstrained reason or technology. The Nephilim embody the monstrous results of humanity, exceeding organic boundaries. Through this lens, the account transforms into a universal myth regarding the perils of pursuing strength or understanding absent understanding. Theological debates persist regarding how literally to interpret the record. Certain customs preserve that actual celestial entities genuinely came down and generated bodily children. Others perceive it as mythological language portraying mortal history. The sons of the divine being virtuous ancestries that intermarried with degraded populations, generating a generation of brutality that required the deluge. Both examinations discover defenders within serious scholars. The enduring appeal of the Watcher account exists perhaps in its combination of components that resonate profoundly with mortal experience. It addresses the beginning of wickedness, not as an abstract notion, however, as historical occurrence with identifiable perpetrators. It explores the peril of appetite, unconstrained by understanding. It cautions regarding information obtained absent corresponding virtue. It communicates to the mortal perception that supernatural forces affect mundane occurrences. Beyond simple entertainment or theological curiosity, the Watcher's account has influenced how Western civilization contemplates the association between paradise and planet, between information and understanding, between appetite and obligation. It has affected art, literature, theology, and popular civilization for exceeding 2 millennia. Whether examined as literal history, symbolic mythology, or something between, the account persists to provoke contemplation regarding the character of uprising, the repercussions of traversing restrictions, and the continuing effects of ancient decisions. The angels who came down to Mount Hermon stay confined in their shadows. However, their account traverses liberated, adapting to every fresh generation, communicating to perennial mortal concerns, cautioning of perils that transcend particular periods and civilizations. In the space between paradise and planet, between essence and physical form, between compliance and appetite, their account discovers permanent residence in mortal awareness. A cautionary legend that refuses to receive overlooking. A mythos that endures precisely because it contacts something genuine regarding the mortal condition and the spiritual realities that encircle it.